Chapter 1076. Know Yourself. Nephis nodded. Song and Valor are going to be in a race to conquer it. They will search for nightmare gates that can be used to establish a beachhead in the unexplored region of the Dream Realm where the Black Pyramid is located. Once they find a comparatively safe ford, they will use the call to transport their saints, masters, and awakened there, establishing temporary outposts. She paused, looked at him, and continued. These outposts will be used to launch expeditions toward the pyramid. The end goal is to find a relatively safe place in close proximity to it, build a true fortress there, and then use that fortress as the staging ground for the conquest of the tomb. Changing Star lingered for a moment. It might be easier to think of it in terms of the Forgotten Shore. Each gate is connected to a seed of nightmare somewhere in the region. Some seeds might be in the depths of the Crimson Labyrinth, and everyone who follows the call to the area around them will be drowned by the Dark Sea. Some seeds, however, might be located on higher ground. Those who enter the Dream Realm near these seeds will be able to survive, and then slowly make their way through the labyrinth. The end goal is to find a place like the Dark City, build a fortress akin to the Bright Castle, and then use it to conquer the Crimson Spire. What an apt metaphor. Sunny couldn't help but smile darkly. They might find out that this task is much harder than they imagine it to be. In theory, such a plan seemed solid. Each of the hundreds, if not thousands, of nightmare gates in East Antarctica was connected to a seed of nightmare in the region surrounding the tomb of Ariel. By relying on the call, these gates could be used to enter the Dream Realm somewhere near the corresponding seed. Then, by pinpointing a suitably safe area and the gate connected to it, the great clans could transport their forces into the Dream Realm without risking instant annihilation. These forces would then explore and fight their way toward the Black Pyramid. The region could contain several citadels. Even by conquering one, Song or Valor would be able to establish a safe and stable corridor to ferry fighters and supplies over. If there were no citadels except for the tomb of Ariel itself, though, the saints would have to play the role of ferrymen. But the mysterious desert was utterly lethal. It was much worse than even the Forgotten Shore. And the forces of the great clans would not only have to fight against the endless flood of nightmare creatures populating it, they would also have to fight against each other. Sunny couldn't help but shiver. Nephis, meanwhile, simply nodded. The task will be a hellish one indeed. But these are the great clans, Sunny. No matter how you and I might feel about them, their fearsome reputation is not unearned. Both Valor and Song represent the absolute pinnacle of human achievement in warfare. If they can't do it, no one can. He remained silent for a while, thinking. The real goal of the great clans was to kill each other, while their secondary goal was to conquer the tomb of Ariel. One naturally led to the other. He now knew that the siege capitals would remain mostly unmolested by their war, at least, unless something unexpected happened. However, both clans would be feverishly seeking suitable gates in East Antarctica, without doubt ambushing and slaughtering each other in the process. Army patrols and the infrastructure of the evacuation corridors could very well become collateral damage in their clashes. Not to mention that they were bound to send the nightmare creatures into a frenzy and maybe even lead the abominations back to the cities. There would be some violence within the siege capitals as well, or at least bloody clandestine operations. Two of the three saints currently present in East Antarctica belong to the warring factions, after all. If the servants of Key Song had an opportunity to deal with Saint Tyrus and Falcon Scott, they would have taken it, without a doubt. The consequences for the civilians sheltered in the city be damned. Bastards. In any case, Sunny had some idea about how things would progress in the coming months now. This was already enough for him to start thinking. Eventually, he glanced at Nephis and hesitated for a few moments. There was one question that was still gnawing at his hem. Sunny sighed. And where will you be while all of this is happening? Nephis looked at him. White sparks danced in her eyes, and then she suddenly smiled. Where do you think? Of course, I will be accompanying Morgan, sister dearest, to Antarctica. Cassie, the firekeepers, and I, all of us are going there with her. I've told you that Valor does not trust me much yet. What better way to earn trust and merit than on the battlefield? He stared at her silently for a while. I guess there is none. So, we are going to meet in the southern quadrant? Changing Star shrugged. If you wish. Or, you can stay out of this mess entirely. You have made it very clear that you don't want to have anything to do with the great clans and their war, so it's up to you if and how much you get involved. Sunny smiled darkly. Up to me, huh? Yeah, no. That ship has sailed. He really could hide in some remote siege capital, use his service record and exalted status to get himself a cushy assignment, and spend the rest of the campaign relaxing as much anyone could relax in Antarctica. However, was he willing to? Did he want to? Not really. If I do not go to hell, who else will go? Sunny had once told the Sin of Solace that the great clans were free to act with impunity because there was no one around to hold them responsible. He did not wish to teach anyone lessons in responsibility, but he did want to teach those bastards a lesson in humility. The harsher and more painful the lesson, the better. I'll make them pay. If I go to hell, I'll drag them with me. Sunny looked at the boundless blue sky, then turned to Nephis and smiled. See you in Antarctica then. Chapter 1077 Midnight Sun. Summer had come to Antarctica. The winds still brought with them a piercing chill, but it was warm enough for the snow to thaw under direct sunlight. Gurgling streams of water turned East Antarctica into a land of countless brooks and numerous lakes, which all glistened in the sun or drowned in the shadows of the tall mountains. The sun itself was distant and cold, but it never disappeared from the blue expanse of the sky. Just like there had been no end to the night, now, there was no end to the day. The twilight of the long dawn had gradually turned into daylight, and now that October was in full swing, the whole continent was suffused with bright radiance and would be for the next 5 months. The situation on the continent, however, was far from light. It was grim and dire, as if Antarctica had submerged deeper into an endless cycle of dreadful nightmares. The chain of nightmares was escalating with each day, and the evacuation army was forced to take more and more desperate measures to withstand it. The remains of a once thriving city were buried under thawing snow, with the skeletal remains of tall buildings rising above it like dark cliffs. This settlement had not been chosen to become a siege capital, and so it was abandoned at the start of the campaign. Now, it was nothing but a desolate ruin. From time to time, that ruin would turn into a battleground, sustaining even more damage. Currently, a furious battle was coming to an end on the streets of the abandoned city. A patrol of soldiers had been chased here by a swarm of nightmare creatures and forced to stand their ground. The humans had fought violently and almost defeated the attacking abominations. But sadly, the sounds of the combat awoke a fiend that had been slumbering in the ruins. The creature had torn a bloody path through the remaining abominations and then slaughtered the soldiers. Now, only one of them remained alive. Lieutenant Catfiend was struggling desperately with the controls of her MWP, but it was of no use. The mighty machine had been damaged too severely and toppled, its vestibular systems going completely offline. She could have brought it back up relying on nothing but her piloting skills, but most of the limb hydraulics were destroyed, and the frame itself was bent and torn, large sections of the alloy armor already missing. Even the coolant pathways were breached, turning the pilot's cabin into a scorching inferno. The paint she used to decorate its walls with drawings was blistering and melting, and Catfiend herself felt as if she was going to melt too. But, of course, she wouldn't. The abomination that had slaughtered her squad was currently on top of the MWP, clawing at the war machine with its powerful limbs. The armor was parting before the terrifying claws like paper. Each strike sent a concussive shockwave through the frame, tossing Catfiend up and down in the tight confines of her safety harness. The creature was going to kill her long before the heat had a chance to. Curse it. There was just no way for her to fight against a fallen demon, and that was what the creature was, most likely. At least the awakened leader of the patrol had called it that before being killed by the fiend. But even knowing how hopeless the situation was, Catfiend stubbornly controlled the only functioning arm of the MWP, bending it at the elbow to press the 7 barrels of the kinetic machine gun installed on the forearm of the war platform to the abomination's side. The barrels spun, unleashing a flood of heavy tungsten rounds into the demon's impenetrable hide. In just a second, the machine gun spat close to 200 armor-piercing bullets. However, all of them simply ricocheted off the harrowing creature's skin, not even bruising it. The fiend was pushed slightly to the side, then glanced at the firing weapon with its mad, burning eyes. In the next moment, the abomination's claws struck, ripping through the MWP's arm and severing it entirely. The next blow finally breached the cockpit, destroying the screens and letting Catfiend see the fiend with her own 2 eyes. She gritted her teeth. At least there's some cool air now. She knew that she was about to die, but she didn't. The battle had caused plumes of thick smoke to rise above the ruins, obscuring the sun and submerging the battlefield in deep darkness. At that moment, the darkness suddenly surged and moved forward. Catfiend blinked, thinking that she was seeing things. 2 giant hands suddenly rose from the ground, grabbing the fallen demon by the shoulders. The hands had matte, inky black skin, slender wrists, and long, dexterous fingers that ended with sharp claws. These claws cut through the abomination's indestructible skin with ease. Then, the dark hands pulled, and ripped the fiend apart. Half of its monstrous body landed to the left of the fallen MWP, the other half to the right. A river of blood and viscera splashed, falling into the turned-up dirt. Just like that, the terrifying creature had been slaughtered. What? Catfiend suddenly felt cold. The fallen demon was a harrowing monster, so what kind of otherworldly horror would be capable of killing it with such ease? As she stared, a figure emerged from the darkness, landing softly on the torn frame of the MWP. It was a young man with porcelain skin and black hair, his eyes glistening like dark gemstones. Despite the biting cold and the nightmarish surroundings, he wore no armor and wielded no weapons. His slender body was covered only by a light tunic of black silk. When the young man appeared, the darkness enveloping the destroyed city suddenly seemed to become deeper, darker, and more frightening. The sight of him was in such stark contrast with the ravaged, war-torn ruin that he seemed more like an apparition than a living being. Catfiend gulped. The young man lingered for a moment, and then looked at her calmly. "Are you all right, soldier?" "Oh gods, he speaks." It took her a few seconds to digest what the eerie stranger had just said. "What?" He leaned forward and grabbed the jagged edges of the breach in the cockpit's armor, easily pulling the alloy apart to widen the gap. "I said, are you all right?" Catfiend lingered for a moment. Yes." The stranger nodded. "Good. I'm Ascended Sunless of the Special Reconnaissance Unit. You can call me Master Sunless or Major Sunless. Let's get you out of this thing."
Chapter 1078. Sunny helped the pilot climb out of the ravaged MWP, then looked around somberly. The ruin of the city was covered by the damn. He had noticed the commotion in the ruins by chance, while making his way through the wilderness to accomplish a different mission. If not for the habit of sending his shadows in a wide circle around him, with a sigh, Sunny helped the young woman climb down from the wreck of the MW. "Here, drinks." The pilot kept staring at him strangely, but he was long used to such stares. He gave her some time. "I am sorry about your comrades, but how did you guys end up in this sector? Did you not?" The young woman, "We did, sir, but by then it was already too late. We were on a routine patrol along the 17th evacuation corridor when we came under attack from a swarm of nightmare creatures. We beat them back and Sunny awkwardly patted the "I see. I know a thing or two about bad luck, Lieutenant." Internally, he was Corridor 17. That place, Corridor 17, connected one of the largest siege capitals in the region to the coastal fortress. Maintaining it was a vital. Sunny himself was on a mission to scout out. After reaching East Antarctica, he had basically received carte blanche to choose any assignment he wanted out of those suitable for an Ascended. The SRU was responsible for prowling the abomination-infested wilderness in search of targets that could pose a serious threat to the siege capitals, keeping tabs on their movements, and even attempting. Needless to say, the task was extremely dangerous and often lethal. The SRU consisted exclusively of powerful. As for Sunny, he was both. The assignment suited him fine, despite the tremendous danger, partially because it granted him a lot. Being a leader had never been something Sunny enjoyed. It was too much. He glanced at the MWP. "Catch your breath. We can't stay for long, though." Looking at her, he couldn't help but remember most of his people were dead now. Only Kim and Luster remained, and, perhaps Quentin. Lester had been shipped back to NQSC long ago. He was now slowly recovering in the hospital complex of the academy, and doing quite well. Their young relationship, however, had to remain a long-distance one for now. Kim herself was still here in East Antarctica, but was kept far away from the now her aspect was being used to determine the vulnerabilities of various nightmares. There were many such specialists stationed at Army headquarters. Beth had been evacuated and reached safety a while back, too. Sonny and she kept in touch, sending each other messages once in a while. However, he had a feel, so most of Sonny's communications were with Rain. His sister was doing well in the safety of NQSC. She was training diligently and not showing as for him. Ever since reaching East Antarctica, Sonny only had 3 goals. Turn the ravenous fiend in. He had spent fragments on the little imp first, then hunted down numerous abominations in hopes of forming the 5th Shadow Corps. Now, as he thought about it, his communication device suddenly came. Where the hell are you? He smiled. Sorry, Jet. I've been delayed Her voice came through the static. Yeah, and I have a nasty swarm of Sonny. I'll send Mongrel your way. Lead them to the rendezvous point. And with that, Sonny glanced at the MW. Time to go, soldier. Say your goodbyes. Then he turned away, giving the young woman some space, and looked up. A long sigh escaped. How bright. I never thought I... Chapter 1070. The pilot did not spend a long time bidding farewell to her comrades. By that point in the campaign, everyone had experienced death had always surrounded those who fought against the nightmare spell. And here in Antarctica, when the young woman returned, however, a confused expression of what the pilot
Where did my MWP go? He looked back. The wrecked war platform was, indeed, gone. In its place, hidden behind a pile of dirt, sat an ugly little creature. It was hurriedly pushing a piece of bent alloy into its wide, toothy mouth with both hands. Noticing that someone was looking, the creature froze for a moment and feverishly continued to chew on the armored alloy, as if afraid that it would be taken away. Sonny rolled his eyes. That little bastard right there ate it. Don't mind him. It was hard to imagine that the scrawny imp had devoured the massive machine, considering that it was dozens of times larger than him, but that was exactly what had happened. Sonny did not know what kind of infernal engine was hidden in the imp's stomach, but the little guy's appetite was inexhaustible. Anything that entered his mouth disappeared without a trace, and there were very few things that his sharp teeth couldn't rip apart. Sonny shuddered, remembering how he had turned the tiny wretch into a shadow. He had done it not long after arriving in East Antarctica. Before, Sonny had been planning to become a tyrant first, but that was because he needed more power, fast, during the siege of Falcon Scott. Now that things had calmed down, the circumstances were not as pressing. He could allow himself to delay a little and made converting the echo of the ravenous fiend a priority. Sonny had possessed 3 shadows before, but funnily enough, only one of them, Saint, came from an echo. The process of conversion itself had looked pretty much the same as the first time. In the tranquil silence of his soul sea, 2 beams of dark light descended from one of the shadow cores. One fell on the echo of the scavenger, the other on a motionless shadow that stood with the rest of them on the still surface of the calm waters. The shadow of the ravenous fiend seemed to dissolve into the dark light, and then the echo became wreathed in black flames that seeped into its flesh, changing it on a fundamental level. The boundless spellweave that was hidden within the echo disappeared. replaced by darkness. A living shadow was now dwelling within the body of the imp instead, 4 transparent and empty embers burning in its depths. Granted, that scene was not as majestic and awe-inspiring as when Saint had become a shadow. The scrawny little bastard could not compare to the magnificent stone knight in any shape or form after all. Nevertheless, that was how Sunny had acquired his 4th shadow. What came next, however, that he did not like to think about one bit. The imp was a blank slate and had tremendous potential for growth, but Sunny had to be careful about what he fed the gluttonous creature. Some types of food were easy to come by, but would produce mediocre results. Worse than that, he strongly suspected that some advancements would prevent more beneficial powers from taking root in the future. There was one he could not compromise on, though: affinity to shadows. And since shadow creatures were almost impossible to find, Sunny had no choice but to feed the hateful gremlin some of his own flesh again. The first time he summoned the fiend into the real world, the tiny creature looked around, then stared at him with fright and ran away, hiding behind Saint's leg. The imp then grabbed her calf with his 8 clawed fingers and cautiously peeked from behind it, trembling slightly. "Get over here, bastard." Unable to refuse Sunny's command, the imp reluctantly abandoned his shelter and slowly waddled over. The moment Sunny offered the gremlin his forearm and ordered him to take a bite, the bastard's eyes ignited with ferocious glee, though. What happened next was a truly ghastly experience for Sunny. He endured it by bitterly fantasizing about killing the vile little creature for the 2nd time. However, it was worth it in the end. The scrawny fiend regained its ability to travel through shadows. Later, Sunny learned that the process of gaining new attributes and abilities was rarely, if ever, so easy and fast. The fiend had already possessed a high affinity to shadows thanks to being one, and Sunny himself was even more unique. He was a divine shadow, after all. These 2 reasons made it possible for the little imp to inherit a vestige of his power in one go. As to how the bastard had managed it the first time around, Sunny had no idea. Maybe the inherent adaptability of the scavengers resonated with the innate formlessness of shadows. Maybe the wretch had simply gotten lucky. The point of it was that he couldn't just command the gluttonous scavenger to devour a nightmare creature and expect the same to happen. It took a long time and a lot of corpses, suitable ones at that, for the imp to grow in the right direction. Luckily, he was not limited to only eating flesh, which was why Sunny was currently concentrating on feeding the imp all kinds of steel, alloy, and mystical metals. The ravenous fiend's bone armor had been rather spectacular, but he was determined to come up with something even more indestructible. Watching as the scrawny bastard hurriedly finished chewing on the last piece of the broken MWP, Sunny smiled slightly, his eyes shining with ominous glee. "Eat, eat, eat more, trashling. I need to fatten you up." The imp suddenly shivered and looked at Sunny with wide, terrified eyes. Sunny suppressed a menacing grin and dismissed the imp, then looked at the pilot. "I got him as an echo. Come, let's go, we need to hurry." Chapter 1080, Marvelous Devil. As a scout, Sunny constantly had to traverse great distances across the abomination-infested wilderness of East Antarctica. He would usually ride atop Nightmare or glide through the shadows with incredible speed, but right now, neither of these methods were an option. His steed was with Saint, and he obviously couldn't leave the stranded MWP pilot behind by turning into a shadow. Theoretically, Sunny could carry the young woman on his back and run, which would be faster than limiting his speed to that of a mundane human. But he was not too desperate to save time. There was an army outpost relatively close to the ruined city, and although normal patrols would be slaughtered if they tried to take the convenient shortcut, nothing that dwelled there could threaten Sunny. As they followed a small river that snaked between barren hills, Sunny summoned the runes and glanced at the list of his shadows. It read, "Shadows, Muldesia, Mitishare, Mitisho." Sunny concentrated on the last string of runes, summoning a detailed description of the little bastard. Shadow. Bisinil Ninyai Mao. Bisinil Nanda. Shadow rank, Transcendent. Shadow class, Devil. Shadow description. Nightmarish land, harboring a bitter grudge in its tiny heart. Driven by resentment and spite, it suffered many trials and conquered untold dangers to become a marvelous devil. But fate was unkind. The ravenous devil met a much more terrible fiend and turned into his shadow. Sunny stared at the runes with a bleak expression. The spell had always liked to tease him, at least he thought that it did. But this one was just unfair. "How come I'm the fiend? The bastard literally has the word fiend in his name." Shaking his head, he moved past the description and continued to read. Shadow attributes. 1. Miyana, Minyu, Bititumun, Wudinayamin. Attribute description. This shadow is favored by fortune. Sunny sighed. His own attribute attracted both incredible and absolutely terrible luck. The imp, however, was blessed with only good fortune. It was most likely the small scavenger's very first innate attribute. No wonder the bastard had survived meeting him twice. Damnation. Peeved by the blatant unfairness, Sunny continued to read. Attribute description. This shadow is a marvelous learner. It is stunningly keen and supremely adaptable, absorbing new knowledge with astonishing speed. Lucky and smart. Well, who cares? At the end of the day, it still didn't help him survive meeting me for the third time. If the wretch was so smart, he should have avoided me like a plague. Sunny had seen these descriptions before, of course, but he still couldn't help seething over them. Attribute description. This shadow possesses an insatiable hunger and a frightening potential for growth. The more it eats, the more it will grow. This attribute already seemed rather great, despite the fact that the imp had not grown even by a centimeter in the last 2 months. Sunny had fed him literally tons of armored alloy, as well as the corpses of many nightmare creatures with steel-like carapaces. He had no idea how much the little fiend had to gobble up to become bigger, but knew that the result would be worth it. The true benefit of the attribute was much more subtle, though, and incredibly precious. It was the fact that, unlike Nightmare and Saint, the imp did not need to consume memories to rise to a higher rank. There was no counter of shadow fragments. Instead, the fiendish shadow simply had to devour. It could become a supreme devil by simply devouring nightmare creatures, or any creatures really, in great numbers. The more powerful, the better. That put Sunny, who was already suffering terribly from the need to procure countless memories, at ease. The imp is indeed lucky. If I had to choose between feeding memories to Saint and Nightmare or him, well, the poor bastard would have definitely starved. Sunny smiled slightly and turned his attention to the last 2 attributes. Attribute description. This fiend is known to shadows. That one was without surprise, and appeared after Sunny had fed the imp with his flesh. It was the same as what Shadowblade Kurt had possessed, and showed a high affinity to shadows. Attribute description. This shadow's flesh possesses qualities of metal. He grinned in satisfaction. Finally, progress. Had been before. It seemed that munching on that MWP had finally pushed the imp over a threshold. He would be much sturdier now, and in the future would even have a chance to become truly indestructible. There had to be a greater iron body as well, after all. Happy to see the ankle-biter achieving something, Sunny finally glanced at the imp's abilities. The runes read, Shadow Abilities. Ability description. This shadow can attain the traits, attributes, and abilities of the creatures it consumes. Ability description. This shadow's teeth possess unnatural sharpness and strength. It can rend and maul even the most resilient things. Ability description. This fiend can move freely between shadows, traveling from one to another in an instant, or diving into them to move with great speed. And that was it. Sunny's 4th shadow, the critter, was a sorry excuse of a transcendent devil, for now, but it would grow to be a real menace one day. In fact, Sunny had a feeling that the imp might just become one of the most terrifying weapons in his arsenal. The ravenous fiend had been an exceedingly dire enemy, but now that he was serving Sunny, and thus enjoying the support of a benevolent, selfless, and supremely generous master, just how much more terrible would the wretched waif become? Walking along the small river, Sunny used shadow manifestation to slaughter a nightmare creature that was waiting to ambush him and the MWP pilot, then sighed. I need to find a couple more of those iron golems I killed last week, or better yet, a whole swarm of them. A horde would be even better. My imp is a growing little wretch, after all. He needs to eat. Chapter 1081, Lake Ruin. Soon they reached the army outpost. There had been a few nightmare creatures that attacked them on the way, including an especially vile, corrupted monster. Sunny tore the former apart with hands woven out of shadows, and cut the latter down personally with a blade created the same way. These days, he tried to avoid getting his own hands dirty, mostly using shadow manifestation to slaughter the enemy. Sunny wanted to hone and refine his mastery of manifestation, and for that he needed a lot of practice. Additionally, he felt that it was unnecessary for him to get up close and personal with every godforsaken abomination standing in his way. Perhaps it was the nature of his current mission as a solitary scout, or perhaps Sunny had simply received a chance to return to being cautious and stealthy after years of being forced to play the role of a frontline fighter. In any case, he strived to only enter melee range with an enemy if he was certain of killing the foe with a single strike. Usually one of Sunny's strikes was enough. If not, he would avoid a confrontation entirely. The army outpost was located underground, similar to the supply depot he had visited once in the Antarctic Center. However, as a member of the Special Reconnaissance Unit, Sunny knew very well where all the Army assets were hidden. Better yet, East Antarctica had no problems with communications, well, except for the usual interference of the call, so he had been able to radio about their arrival in advance. Sunny and the surviving MWP pilot were met by a cohort of sleep-deprived awakened. Despite their visible fatigue, the soldiers stood at attention and saluted him respectfully. Their eyes betrayed a hint of reverence. This again. Sunny was met with such stares anywhere he went in Antarctica, at least among the soldiers. The First Army and the Second Army were merged into one military now, but within it, people who had been in the southern quadrant since day one of the Chain of Nightmares were treated with silent respect that went tenfold for those who had been a part of the Antarctic Center contingent. The Antarctic Center had been the most terrifying battlefield of the operation yet, and almost the entire field army sent there had been wiped out. There were only a few survivors here and there, mostly those who had been among the evacuated wounded. Needless to say, Sunny was both a veteran of the Antarctic Center and an ascended. That was why most soldiers treated him with veneration. "Master Sunless, sir." He nodded at the welcoming party and handed over the MWP pilot to them. The young woman had done well keeping pace with him on the way to the outpost, but now that they had reached safety, she looked to be on the verge of collapse. Of course, it was not at all surprising. Sunny sighed and glanced at the awakened. "At ease. Take good care of the lieutenant. Oh, and by the way, I've cleared a path through the hills and dealt with the corrupted monster that had been stalking the area. If you hurry, you might harvest what is left of it before more abominations show up." The soldiers looked at each other, their eyes glinting. That monster had been causing a lot of trouble for the outpost, especially considering that it had blocked the pathway through the hills. With the creature gone, logistics would become much easier for them. "Thank you, sir." Sunny nodded. "Well then, I'll be off." He looked at the MWP pilot, lingered for a few moments, and then said awkwardly, "Stay alive, soldier." With that, Sunny stepped through the shadows and disappeared from view. He had wasted a lot of time already and was running late for the rendezvous with Soul Reaper. The soldiers remained standing there for a while, staring at the empty space where he had stood before. Eventually, one of them said, "That was him. The devil." Another nodded with a stunned face, but of course, Sunny was already far away and did not hear any of it. The sun was circling in the sky, never falling behind the horizon. He glided through the shadows where he could, ran where he couldn't. From time to time, Sunny simply hid in the shadows, waiting for large swarms of nightmare creatures to pass by. These pauses slowed him down, but they also allowed him to recover some essence. He avoided getting into fights to preserve more of it, as well, and also because there was no reason to. It was already evening, or whatever passed for one in this strange land, when Sunny drew near another ruin. The city in front of him was almost entirely destroyed and drowned by a vast lake, with only the remains of tall towers rising above the icy water. The ruin was different from the one from before and much older. It had been left behind by the wars that humans waged on each other during the dark times, not the rampage of the Chain of Nightmares. Nevertheless, the drowned city was Sunny's current mission. He hid himself in the shadows of a rusted wreck and studied the ruin. There were bodies of nightmare creatures floating near one of the towers, painting the water black. Each of them seemed to have been killed by a single arrow. Sunny observed the area for a few minutes, noticing strange ripples on the surface of the lake. There were more abominations hiding underwater. Finally satisfied, he activated his comm and contacted Jet. "Reaper, it's Devil. I've arrived." A few seconds later, her voice came through the static. "Took you long enough. Where are you?" He looked around. Southern shore, near an old wreck on the slope of a flat hill. Jet took a few minutes to respond. "I see it. Move west for about a kilometer, then follow a collapsed tower into the lake. From there you'll be able to see 3 huge smokestacks. I'm in the middle one, near the top. Get here as soon as possible, and be careful of the water. It is teeming with schools of tiny, hungry fishes." Sunny lingered for a moment. "Got it. What about the target?" Soul Reaper responded in a few seconds, her voice sounding a bit tense. "It's in the middle of the lake. I was waiting for you to arrive before trying to get a better look." Nodding, Sunny glanced at the ripples in the cold water one more time, and then dashed out of his shelter. Chapter 1082, Ancient Chimneys. He reached the giant chimney without too much problem. avoiding the teeth of the vicious fish-like creatures with the help of the dark wing and a couple of perilous leaps. The structure was wide and incredibly tall, reaching at least 300 meters into the sky, and that was just the part visible above the water. There were a few holes in the frame of the alloy smokestack, so Sonny did not waste time jumping through one of them. He found himself in a vast, dark well, still water radiating bone-chilling cold a few meters beneath his feet. A tiny circle of light was visible hundreds of meters above. Sonny did not know what kind of industrial behemoth had demanded such an enormous chimney, 3 of them in fact, and what kind of poison had been billowing out of them into the atmosphere in the past. However, even now, decades or even centuries later, the air inside was acrid and hard to inhale, reminding him of the worst days in the outskirts. Grimacing, Sonny looked around and then jumped to a piece of scaffolding a dozen or so meters above his current position. Landing noiselessly on the weathered alloy, he smiled at Saint, who had been standing there, still as a statue, holding a bow in one hand. The taciturn knight turned her head slightly, acknowledging his arrival, then indifferently continued to watch the base of the smokestack. He could feel Nightmare hiding in the darkness nearby, dissolved into the shadow form. The black steed moved, greeting him, and then grew still once again. "Good work, guys," Sonny's calm hissed. "Get up here, I'm bored out of my mind." He sighed, then turned into a shadow himself and ascended the tall structure, gliding upward in a wide spiral. As Sonny was going up the old alloy walls, he found himself involuntarily thinking about how long it would take Imp to eat the whole thing. Then, he caught himself and scoffed. "Gods, what am I thinking about?" But it was really a lot of alloy. At the top of the smokestack, strange machines were installed into the mouth of the well, and the walls were blackened by fire and soot. The acrid smell was somewhat reduced by the proximity to the open sky. Jet was sitting on one of the pieces of machinery, her feet hanging above the abyssal drop. Noticing Sonny step out of the shadows, she closed the lid of an army-issued thermos, threw it into her backpack, and grinned. "Here you are." He nodded. "Yeah, sorry for making you wait." Soul Reaper shook her head. "I've been on a long reconnaissance mission the entire week. Honestly, having a chance to just sit and relax for a few hours was exactly what I needed." Jet had joined the Special Reconnaissance Unit, just like Sonny. They mostly worked alone, but for the more dangerous missions, Army Command grouped 2 or more scouts together. As a result, the 2 of them continued to cooperate and fight side by side through most of the past few months. By now, they made for a very good team. Jet stood up and looked around, studying the ancient machinery. "Hey, do you know what these things were for?" Sonny shook his head. "No. Do you?" She walked along the edge of the alloy platform and nodded. "It's a filtration system. Basically, one furnace pushed a constant stream of toxic smoke through the smokestack, and on top of it was another furnace. This one meant to burn all the toxicity out of the smoke and prevent it from getting into the atmosphere. So, each of these chimneys used to shoot out a colossal plume of fire into the sky. Must have been quite a sight, especially in winter. Sonny scratched the back of his head. "Sounds kind of stupid." Jet glanced at him with a bleak expression. "Well, I'm not an engineer. It must have worked. Otherwise, why waste all that time and energy on constructing filters? Anyway, let's get to the top. The faster we finish the mission, the faster we can get the hell out of this stench." They scaled the last dozen or so meters of the smokestack using an ancient, rickety ring ladder and climbed onto the lip of the giant chimney. It was as wide as a road. From here, most of the lake and the city drowned by it could be easily seen. Sonny stared down, appreciating the surreal beauty of the desolate landscape beneath them. Almost at the same time, 2 of his shadows reached the top of the other 2 giant smokestacks. Jet glanced at him. "Well?" He hesitated for a few moments. "The one to our left is empty, but the right one, there is something hiding inside. Something huge." All the shadow could see were loops of flesh coiled inside the dark well of the ancient smokestack, filling almost a third of it. Jet sighed with relief. "Well, good, because we need to get to the left one. Leave that thing, whatever it is, alone." Sonny nodded, ordering his shadow to hide itself and keep an eye on the gargantuan creature. The 3 towering chimneys were not too far away from each other, so getting from one to another was not a problem to them. However, it was not very safe. If something attacked you in the air, staying alive would be a challenge. So, unless someone like Kai was around, at least 2 people were required to keep each other safe. Sonny temporarily borrowed Morgan's warbow from Saint and covered Jet as she glided across the wide gap between smokestacks using a flight memory. She reached the next chimney, then summoned half a dozen sharp throwing stars and did the same for him. Sunny used the dark wing to breach the gap and soon joined Jet. Now, they were very close to coming in sight of the target of this mission. He frowned. "Do you feel it?" Soul Reaper slowly nodded. "Yeah, the call is much stronger here. There must be a Category 3 gate nearby." They walked to the opposite side of the smokestack and looked down. From that position, nothing obstructed their view of the middle of the lake, and there, nestled between the ancient ruins, Sunny sighed. "That is going to be trouble." Chapter 1083 Reconnaissance. The two of them lowered themselves to the weathered alloy, looking cautiously over the edge. Far away, in the middle of the ruined city, an enormous body of a ghastly creature was hidden between the rubble, long swathes of it submerged into the water. The creature resembled a monstrous centipede that was at least 100 meters long. It was encased in pale chitin. No, not chitin. Bone. The giant centipede seemed to be covered in countless thousands of human skulls, all of them stuck together to form a morbid carapace. Its horrid maw was large enough to swallow an armored APC and full of grotesque, bone-white teeth. On its head, 2 tall, dead trees grew from the carapace of skulls, like skeletal horns. Making a point to only keep the abominable creature in his peripheral vision and not stare at it directly, powerful abominations could often sense a gaze directed at them. Sunny sighed. That is going to be trouble. He had chosen to remain as quiet as possible, relying on the blessing to convey his thoughts to Jet instead of speaking aloud. She nodded, then responded in the same manner, her voice resounding clearly inside his head despite the deathly silence and the howling of the wind. "Look at its mouth." Sunny turned his head a little and watched. Far below them, the centipede twisted its long neck and convulsed, heaving. Then, it opened its maw and vomited out a huge pile of moist, slime-covered bones. For a few moments, it looked as if the abomination was having problems digesting its prey. Then, however, the pile of bones moved, slowly coalescing into a nightmarish, misshapen creature. The revolting bone monster rose shakily to its varied limbs and staggered away, soon disappearing beneath the water. Looking at the surface of the lake, Sunny frowned. How many of these creatures had the centipede created already? He lingered for a moment, then glanced at Jet. "It's a corrupted tyrant," she grimaced. "Yeah, seems that way." Soul Reaper cautiously opened her backpack and took out several bulky devices. Those were sensor arrays and recorders the army had issued to them, all based on complicated spell tech technology. The bulk mostly came from various isolating agents the designers wrapped the sensitive internals in, hoping to negate the detrimental effects of the call. Sadly, the interference of the nearby gate was too strong for the spell-tech equipment to achieve anything. After several minutes of fruitless attempts to gather data, Jet sighed, glanced at Sunny, and shook her head. He gave her a shrug. "Contact Army Command, then." She remained motionless for a few moments, then moved away from the edge of the smokestack's lip and activated her military comm. The static noise must have been dreadful, but Jet still managed to deliver a message. "HQ, this is Recon 4 and Recon 9. We are at the mission site. Target visual confirmed. Threat level Core 5. Requesting analyst support." Soul Reaper waited for a few moments, then raised 3 fingers into the air. That meant they had to wait for 3 minutes. "Fast, HQ is either not too busy today, or sees this mission as a top priority." The former seemed unlikely, so it was probably the latter. With a sigh, he summoned a memory. Soon, a circle of green patinated bronze appeared in his hands, with a lens of roughly polished crystal encased within. This antique-looking glass was both pretty simple and interesting in function. It was a twin memory. Somewhere in the Army headquarters, there was an awakened wielding an identical circle of patina-covered bronze, and the two were connected. That allowed the diviners and other analysts to extend their senses across the continent, even if the technological solutions failed. Memories like this were rare and extremely precious, but each of the scouts serving in the Special Reconnaissance Unit had been issued one. Sunny shifted slightly and aimed the looking glass at the distant centipede. A couple of minutes later, he sensed the memory reaching for his essence and poured a generous amount of it into the murky crystal. The connection was established. Jet crawled back and pressed herself into the cold alloy by his side. After a few seconds, she sent Sunny a mental message. "They're looking." Down in the ruins, the ghastly centipede heaved out another bone monstrosity and swayed its head lightly, as if sensing some disturbance. Both Sunny and Jet froze, holding their breaths. Shivering in the wind, he made a miserable face. "That's so unfair. I'm the only one who actually needs to breathe." A few minutes passed in tense silence. Then, a few more. Eventually, Sunny felt the bronze circle fall asleep. The pull on his essence disappeared as well. At that moment, Jet glanced at him. Seems like Army Command is on edge about that thing. They need some time to arrange an appropriate response though. We're to stay here and observe, reporting immediately if it starts moving. Sunny sighed, then looked around. At that height, the wind was strong and chilly. There was no shelter on the alloy lip of the giant chimney, and the acrid smell could still be felt here, permeating the air. He shook his head in resignation. Great, I'll take a nap then. Jet blinked a couple of times. Hey, how come you get to sleep first? I haven't slept in a week. Sunny stared at her gloomily, then sighed again. Fine, you go first. I'll keep an eye on the tyrant. Soul Reaper flashed him a smile, then turned on her side, put the backpack under her head, and seemed to immediately pass out. Sunny was left to observe the appalling giant centipede alone. He chewed on his lip. Why does she even need to sleep? She's dead. Sadly, Jet was already blissfully asleep. The tyrant methodically continued to create bone puppets, seemingly oblivious to the fact that it was being watched. The mysterious being hiding in another smokestack similarly remained passive. A few hours passed. Sunny patiently waited until his shift was over, then woke up Jet and handed the responsibility of keeping watch on the tyrant to her. Tired and bored, he tried to get comfortable on the cold alloy and closed his eyes. Seemingly a second later, Jet shook him awake. It's on the move. Sunny rubbed his eyes, then groggily looked down. The enormous centipede was slithering through the shallow water, and the surface of the lake around it was boiling. Hundreds of bone abominations were following the pallid creature, much more than he had expected there to be. Crap. Soul Reaper was already reporting to Army Command. Half a dozen seconds later, she started crawling away from the edge. They are sending 2 entire companies to deal with it, the Wolves and the Night Singers. We are to follow the thing and inform Army Command on its movements, then rendezvous with the assault force and help them take the abomination down. Sunny was already moving, the bronze-looking glass dissolving into a stream of sparks in his hand. Despite the perilous situation, a crooked smile appeared on his face. The Wolves and the Night Singers, huh? It seems I'll get to spend some quality time with Effie and Kai soon. Chapter 1084, Following the Tyrant. For the next few days, Sunny and Jet stealthily pursued the skull centipede. These days were long, tense, and perilous. Not only did they have to brave the wilderness, but they also had to keep up with the ghastly abomination while not being seen or sensed by it. On a few occasions, they had almost been discovered, barely managing to salvage the situation at the last moment. Sunny was not sure what would have happened if the creature had found them. With Saint supporting the 2 scouts from the shadows, they at least had a slim chance of slaying the tyrant, but a battle like that would be a dire one. It would have had to be one of those battles where he was forced to put everything on the line, only surviving by the skin of his teeth. In the past, Sunny had fought plenty of battles like that. He had grown so used to walking the thin line between life and death that he did not even consider such things unusual anymore. That mad balancing act was just par for the course. However, he also knew that he would not remain on the winning side forever. If he kept risking everything, his luck was bound to run out one day. After Falcon Scott, his way of thinking about things shifted. Sunny was now much more experienced, and with that experience came cold, calculating prudence. His chances of defeating the skull centipede and its army of bone abominations would be much higher with the support of 2 entire companies of Awakened. And so, he was determined to meet this enemy on a battlefield of his choosing, with the odds stacked in his favor as much as the circumstances allowed. Jet was of the same mind. They followed the plan and put all their effort into remaining hidden. The centipede slithered across the vast plains of East Antarctica, eviscerating everything in its path. It had no mercy for the other nightmare creatures, slaughtered swarms of them like helpless ants. After each massacre, the giant abomination would devour the corpses of its prey and coil its body into a macabre burrow of skulls, then wreathe and spew out more bone fiends. The centipede's army continued to grow as it advanced through the wilderness. With each day, Sunny and Jet became more and more despondent. It had been hard to tell at the start, but now there was no denying it. The tyrant's course put it on a direct collision course with one of the siege capitals in East Antarctica. Each human stronghold on the continent was surrounded by vast masses of frenzied nightmare creatures, and even more dead ones. Tall piles of bodies covered the killing fields, growing with each passing day. If the skull centipede was allowed to launch an attack on a siege capital, it would already be bad enough. However, if it managed to gain access to all those corpses, the strength of its army would increase exponentially, and the threat posed by the creature would explode in magnitude. By then, only the intervention of a saint would prevent a disaster. The saints, however, were already busy racing endlessly from place to place, solving one crisis after another without rest, which was why it was important to stop the abomination as soon as possible. On the fourth day of the pursuit, the centipede clashed with a whole horde of nightmare creatures, butchering hundreds of them and scaring the rest away. It dragged its massive body onto the battlefield, then got to the grisly business of consuming all the mangled bodies. One dead abomination after another disappeared into its massive maw, emotionlessly swallowed by the dreadful tyrant. Sunny and Jet were observing the process from a safe distance as they hid between two enormous boulders. On the ground between them lay a scattering of bleeding carcasses. They themselves had engaged in a short and gruesome fight with a pack of nightmare creatures just minutes ago. Now that a suitable shelter was cleared, they could rest easy for a few hours. Sunny frowned. It killed too many this time. Considering how long it takes to create a bone soldier, I'd say we'll be stuck here for a full day. The tyrant's army will grow by a lot. Jet shrugged. The more it is delayed, the better. Army command will have time to prepare. She watched the giant centipede devour its victims for a few moments, then took a few steps back and contacted the headquarters to make a report. Soon after that, Soul Reaper's icy blue eyes suddenly gleamed. Understood. She deactivated her comm and looked at Sunny with a grin. It's happening. The welcoming party has already arrived. We need to overtake the monstrosity, meet up with them, and prepare the festivities. Sunny let out a relieved sigh. Finally, a hunt like this one was not easy to arrange. Simply deploying troops outside the siege capital was a dangerous task by now. The wilderness was teeming with numerous nightmares creatures, and an expedition force risked drowning in a horde of them before even reaching the intended target. It took a lot of courage and competence to navigate a course through the enemy territory. If the target was on the move, the task only grew that much harder. Luckily, this time, Army Command was receiving constant updates on the creature's location from Sunny and Jet, so tracking its path had been easier. And now, finally, almost every piece was in place. All that remained was for the scouts to join the assault force and spring the trap on the menacing tyrant. Sunny smiled. Let's go then. They silently abandoned their shelter and made a wide circle around the location of the skull centipede, then moved away with as much speed as they could allow themselves without risking attracting the attention of migrating hordes of nightmare creatures. Half a day later, Sunny and Jet arrived at the shore of a wide river. The landscape made it so that there weren't many places to cross it for many kilometers around, with only a single ford formed by a scattering of giant boulders. As they traversed the river, jumping from one stone to another, Sunny's comm suddenly came alive. A familiar voice came through the static. Well, it isn't. Frog, welcome. Some of it got swallowed up by the interference, but the last word was very easy to discern. Doofus. Sunny stopped for a moment and looked at the opposite bank of the river, where a tall figure suddenly rose from the ground. Effie waved her hand and grinned. Ah, venerable Master Sunless, how nice of you to pay a visit. Chapter 1085, Wolf Army. Sunny and Jet looked like quite the pair. Both were wearing black, which made for a stark contrast with their pale skin and raven hair. Granted, Soul Reaper looked more imposing in her fitting black leather armor. Sunny, on the other hand, wore a simple silk tunic and a pair of dainty shoes. He was also unarmed. Actually, he was perhaps the more threatening of the two. People were used to seeing Awakened wear suits of impregnable armor and wield powerful weapons. It was the sight of someone who didn't feel the need to do so, even in the deadly reaches of East Antarctica, that was truly frightening. He made the last jump, landing softly on the ground not too far away from Effie. From here, Sunny could sense hundreds of shadows somewhere nearby. He looked around, noticing mundane soldiers and Awakened hidden here and there along the river shore, all keeping watch on the surrounding area. The first irregular company had numbered 42 Awakened and 7 Masters. The two companies Effie and Kai commanded, however, were different. Unlike the special unit Sunny had belonged to, these were companies meant for general combat. Each of them consisted of close to 100 Awakened and 10 times that many mundane soldiers, complete with a platoon of mighty MWPs and a robust stable of specialized vehicles that ranged from heavy artillery to support and resupply. 2 of these companies together made for a small army. Effie walked over, a wide smile on her face. Sunny, long time no see. She looked quite impactful. His friend had always been a sight to behold, with her impressively tall stature, athletic build, and generous figure. Now, however, Effie resembled an incarnation of a beautiful war deity much more than she resembled a mere mortal. The main reason for this was her armor. It was as though Effie had been dipped in liquid steel, which then clung tightly to her body, tracing every toned, graceful line of it. Sonny had once thought that the undying chain felt like a second layer of skin. However, in his case, that was simply a metaphor. The armor of the vibrant huntress, on the contrary, could be described the same way quite literally. There was a piece of white cloth tied around her waist, and another one covering her chest, but other than that, Effie's whole body was exposed, and seemed as if it had been cast of lustrous steel. Only her head was uncovered, for now. That armor, of course, was the transcendent memory she had received after slaying one of the immortal chain lord of the Kingdom of Hope, the Sun Prince. Sonny coughed. Just looking at Effie would make one's blood run hot. But that wasn't all. Currently, she had not even activated her ascended ability. Once she did, the fire burning in the hearts of the soldiers who saw her would become quite real, coursing through their veins and granting them actual power. It was as though Raised by Wolves was sharing some of her astonishing physical might with her followers. An involuntary smile found its way onto Sonny's face. "What are you talking about? We saw each other 2 weeks ago." Effie shook her head energetically. "That doesn't count. Every time you come to the island, you and Cassie immediately slink to the basement to spend a few quality hours closely studying the floor. The two of us, though, haven't had proper fun in ages." She grinned and then shifted her gaze to Jet, who was listening to their conversation with a strange expression on her face. "Oh, and welcome to you too, Miss Soul Reaper. Thanks for keeping this doofus alive. I know he's a handful." After saying that last part, Effie lingered for a moment and winked. Jet blinked a couple of times. The two of them met a few times, but she had not really been exposed to Effie's personality before. Sonny couldn't tell if she was bewildered or amused. Eventually, Soul Reaper smiled a little. "Sure, call me Jet." He stared at them with a glum expression. "Keeping me alive, really? That's funny. Don't you have a habit of occasionally trying to kill me?" Soul Reaper's smile turned into a grin. "Oh, come on. I haven't tried to kill you in at least a couple of months, so I don't know where this is coming from." Sonny shook his head, then glanced at Effie and smiled. "It's good to see you too, Effie." He looked around and asked, "Where's the other one?" She nodded, then gestured for them to follow. "He's asleep. Now that the battle is drawing close, the two of us take turns sleeping. Both of us need to be fresh for the battle with the tyrant, while at least one has to be awake at all times before that, so that arrangement works." They walked up the slope of the shore. Gradually, the hidden camp of the small army revealed itself, with hundreds of soldiers soberly preparing for the upcoming battle. Awakened, mundane soldiers, MWP pilots, operators of combat vehicles. All of them were throwing wide-eyed glances at the three masters. "Who is that with the boss? Are those the SRU scouts? Is it me, or is our boss acting too friendly with that guy? Gods, isn't that Soul Reaper Jet? Holy hell, that's Soul Reaper and Devil. No way, let me see. I heard the two of them fought a corrupted Titan in the Antarctic Center. That can't be right, can it? They wouldn't be alive if they did. Soul Reaper might be tough, but our boss is definitely tougher. I once saw Devil slaughter an entire swarm of nightmare creatures without lifting a finger. He just stood there, and they were all shredded into little pieces. I swear to gods, it's true." Sonny ignored the whispers and followed Effie. His shadows, however, took a good look around. He was about to go into battle side by side with these people, so he had to know all about them. The soldiers of the two companies looked competent, determined, and in high spirits. The Wolves and the Night Singers were technically not counted as special forces, but among the rank and file of the evacuation army, they had already earned the reputation of elite units. They were led by two of the most fearsome masters in the world, after all. The soldiers were mixed among each other, but funnily enough, it was easy to see which belonged to which company. The Wolves were more boisterous, lively, and rough around the edges. The Night Singers were more calm, reserved, and good-natured. It was as if they had assumed the personalities of their leaders. Sonny smiled with the corner of his mouth, then shook his head. They walked along a row of camouflaged tents and approached a particular one, which looked no different from all the others. Effie suddenly made a fist and banged it against her bare thigh, producing a loud metallic ring. "Wake up, Birdie! The most honest person in two worlds is here." Chapter 1086, Shared Pain. There was some rustling inside the tent, and then Kai emerged from it, looking as handsome and dazzling as ever. No, even more so. Sunny's face became a little dull. His friend had reached borderline criminal levels of attractiveness after becoming a master, mesmerizing most mundane humans by simply appearing in front of them. But Sunny had thought that a couple of months in the mud and muck of Antarctica would rub some of that glamour off. However, he had been sorely mistaken. If anything, Kai only became more captivating. His natural charm had acquired a hint of reserved military valiance, becoming more subdued, but also much more arresting. His green eyes were still as electric as ever, but now there was a quiet, almost melancholic depth to them that made one deeply desire to comfort and console the young man. Those eyes were nothing short of compelling. Kai smiled, making all three of them, Sunny, Effie, and Jet, hold their breaths for a moment. "Sunny," ascended Jet, "it is so good to see you." Even his voice was like a soothing melody. "That bastard." Sunny wasn't even angry about how stunning his friend was. What really disheartened him was what Kai was wearing. The archer was clad in a beautiful suit of ivory armor that seemed to be made out of impregnable scales, with a few insets of burnished bronze blazing between them with reflected sunlight. It was tied at the waist by a sash of burnt umber color, which emphasized the rich auburn splendor of his hair. The armor was made of dragon scales, and was a transcendent memory Kai had received after slaying the ivory dragon Severax. Both Effie and Kai had come into possession of a transcendent armor in the second nightmare. Sunny used to have an armor like that too, which he had gotten for killing Solvain for the first time. But, of course, it had been destroyed by Goliath, and now he was the only person of the three without one. Ah, that really grinds my gears. Sunny winced, but was then distracted from his resigned self-pity by Jet, who smiled and stretched her hand out for a handshake. "Ascended Nightingale, I don't think I've had the pleasure of meeting you before." Indeed, this was the first time the two of them met. Sunny glanced at Soul Reaper bleakly. "At least she is not a fangirl. Like someone I know." Still, Jet had not even tried to shake Effie's hand. What was up with that? The four of them exchanged a few words and headed for a larger tent that stood nearby, serving as the improvised strategy room for the small army. As they walked, Sunny briefly clasped forearm with Kai. "How are you doing?" After the things he had experienced in Falcon Scott, Sunny held a somewhat different view of the charming archer, and of what his friend had shared with him in the sanctuary of Noctis. Back then, he knew that Kai was deeply hurt by what had transpired in the Ivory City, both physically and mentally. He had been a centurion who led soldiers into a war against Solvain's zealots, only to watch his soldiers die and disappear in the flames of the dragon, and then be crippled by those flames himself. Sunny had thought that the pain of defeat and becoming a cripple was what haunted his friend the most. But after experiencing the burden and privilege of being in command and learning how it felt to watch his people die, now he thought differently. Kai smiled softly. "I am doing well. Thank you for asking, Sunny. But I really am. I feel like I'm in the right place." Sunny nodded, thinking that he understood. Kai had always had these naive notions of what was right and wrong, and what a good person was meant to do with the power all awakened possessed. For someone like him, coming to Antarctica was, perhaps, a very sincere endeavor. He glanced at Effie. Come to think of it, the Merry Huntress had lost people in the nightmare too. She watched all the other girls perish under the ruthless training methods of the War Maidens, powerless to save any of them. Even Cassie had experienced powerlessness and loss, with all the other priestesses and people of the Night Temple, including her cherished mentor, the one in the north, ending up slaughtered by Mordred. All of them had felt it. Did Nephis feel the same? Probably not. But then again, no one knew what she had lived through in the second nightmare. Changing Star was strangely reticent about that particular ordeal. They entered the tent, gathering around a fold-out table that had a small holographic projector placed on it. A topographical map of the area was projected into the air, with their location and the last known whereabouts of the skull centipede marked on it in red. Sunny, however, paid it no attention, still lost in his thoughts. After a while, he shook them off and honed in on the conversation. Kai was speaking. "There is simply no other path. The creature will definitely try to cross the river near the ford, and so that is where we will ambush it." Jet shook her head. "You are mistaken. It is large enough to ford the river anywhere. Its minions don't breathe, so they can simply walk along the bottom and crawl out of the water on the other side. The current is nowhere near strong enough to be an obstacle for them." The charming archer sighed, then nodded. "That is correct. which was why I said near the ford, not directly using the ford. The landscape is going to push the tyrant into this general area, but we have no way of knowing where exactly it will enter the river. Sonny frowned, already sensing where this was going. So, what is the plan then? Effie chuckled. Well, what else? Since we don't know where it's going, we'll just have to make sure that it comes to where we want it to come. Sonny let out a resigned sigh. So, who is going to be the bait? Effie awkwardly scratched the back of her head. I mean, you don't have to, if you don't want to. He remained silent for a moment, then scoffed. Kai smiled a little. Honestly, it can be any of us. Oh, I'm sorry, Master Jet. I'm afraid I'm not entirely familiar with your capabilities. What I meant to say was that Effie, Sonny, and I all have ways of making sure that we survive leading the creature to the ambush. So, any of us three can go. Sonny slowly shook his head. No, I'll go. I have to contribute at an earlier stage of the battle, because I might not be of much use at the later stage. It was true. With how close Sonny was to forming the fifth core, chances were that he would pass the threshold right in the middle of a furious melee. If that happened, he would have to struggle to simply stay alive. As for being useful, he was not sure if he'd be able to do anything at all. Chapter 1087, War Masters. The pallid centipede was slithering across a desolate landscape, followed by an army of abominable bone creatures. Its massive body tore forward, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. The ground was pierced and upturned by its 1,000 sharp legs, the ancient boulders shattered, the brooks of clear water spoiled with and turned into streams of poison. Soon, a wide river appeared in the distance. The ghastly tyrant did not slow down, continuing its ruinous advance. Then, however, the monstrous centipede slowed down. Its appalling head swiveled, rising into the air. Its harrowing maw opened. The branches of the dead trees that served as the creature's horns swayed lightly in the wind. The wind had brought with it a strange sound, the distant weeping of a flute. The centipede lingered for a few moments, then suddenly changed direction, lunging toward the source of the discordant sound. It did not have eyes, but the black eye sockets of the countless skulls forming its carapace seemed to radiate dark, ineffable malice. The corrupted tyrant pursued the source of the simple melody. However, the flute player remained elusive like a ghost. Sometimes the creature seemed to draw near the player, but he always managed to slip away at the last moment. All it found were empty shadows. However, at some point the pursuit came to an end. The hideous centipede had almost reached the river by that point. In front of it was a natural ford formed by a line of enormous boulders, with only their tops emerging from the water. On the opposite side of the river, a lone human was sitting cross-legged on a stone, playing a strange emerald flute. It was a young man with pale skin and dark hair, wearing a tunic of black silk. Sonny did not pay any attention to the harrowing centipede and continued to play the flute. His fingers moved nimbly, but the melody he created was pretty rough, to say the least. He sighed. I thought I improved, but maybe not. On the other shore, the tyrant froze for a second, then rushed forward. The creature dove into the river, raising a towering wave, and its soldiers followed. Some of the bone abominations jumped heavily across the boulders, most simply dove into the cold water after their ruler. Sonny waited for a moment, then dismissed the bone singer and looked at the sky. The sun was still visible, but since it was close to the horizon, its light was dim. As he watched, several things happened at the same time. First, a series of explosions thundered, demolishing the boulders of the ford. Giant fountains of water rose into the air. Second, hundreds of human figures rose from the trenches dug higher up the slope. Third, a barrage of artillery shells and tungsten rounds descended upon the bone abominations from beyond the hills. The creatures shuddered, but resisted the mundane implements of war. Their progress, however, was slowed. That was when the awakened attacked. Numerous enchanted arrows and magical projectiles rained on the soldiers of the Skull Centipede's army. This time, the damage was apparent. A hulking creature that had just fallen into the river exploded into hundreds of bone fragments. Another lost a limb. Yet another one was suddenly covered by a layer of sizzling amber liquid that corroded the bones, eating through them like acid, and more, much more. But that was just the start. Even though that initial salvo destroyed dozens of dreadful abominations, there were many hundreds of them left. There was the tyrant itself as well. A beautiful figure that seemed to be cast of steel appeared on the slope in front of the trenches, wielding a spear and a large round shield. Her voice boomed across the battlefield, filling the hearts of the soldiers with maddened fervor. Wolves, prepare for war. Sonny turned his head and glanced at Effie, feeling his blood boil from her battle cry. As he did, a strange thing happened. He suddenly felt exhilarating power rush into his body. It was as though he was suddenly as mighty as a ferocious beast, as resilient as a granite wall, and as sharp as a steel sword. And that was not just a feeling. His strength, speed, endurance, and resilience did indeed undergo a striking improvement. It was as though his body had received a comprehensive overhaul, becoming so much more suited for battle. Incredible. Every time he was exposed to Effie's ascended ability, Sunny couldn't help but feel awed. For him, who had already enjoyed the augmentation of the shadows, the physical boost was not that pronounced. But for the awakened soldiers, and especially mundane humans, it must have been a true blessing. The most frightening part, however, was that this ability had no limit to how many people could be empowered by it. Anyone who saw Effie and was deemed an ally by her would receive its benefit. Their number did not even affect the rate with which she consumed essence. The only detriment, albeit a small one, was that the soldiers had to maintain a line of sight with their commander to enjoy the boon of her power. However, considering that Effie almost always preferred to fight on the front line, that was usually not a problem. Just as he had expected, the eyes of the soldiers ignited with burning resolve at the sound of her voice. The soldiers of her company suddenly raised their heads and let out boisterous howls, acting like an army of actual wolves. And then, another voice joined them. This one sonorous and clear, easily drowning out all the rest. Kai's voice. When Sunny heard it, his heart suddenly shook. Instantly, all the unnecessary thoughts were erased from his head, leaving only the pure, flaming, indomitable desire to do battle. Even though this change was not physical, it might have been even more profound than the empowerment of Effie's aspect, because it affected the heart. Even Sunny, for whom the effect was somewhat muted because of how guarded his mind and soul were, felt incredibly inspired. The clarity bestowed by Kai's call would do wonders for the soldiers in this battle. Sunny shook his head slightly. Scary. Kai's ability was just too terrifying. An Ascended would most likely be able to resist it to some degree, but mere Awakened had no choice but to be compelled. As for mundane humans, if the handsome enchanter chose to misuse his powers, they would do anything he told them to. They would happily end their lives if he asked. Luckily, Kai would never do that. Instead, he used his power to inspire the soldiers and make them stronger. With Sunny serving as a perfect scout, Effie strengthening the bodies of the soldiers, and Kai inspiring their hearts, the threat of the corrupted tyrant suddenly did not seem overwhelming. As the head of the skull centipede emerged from the water, it was met with a furious onslaught of attacks. Strengthened by their two leaders, the small army was burning with the desire and ability to win this battle. Chapter 1088, Force Multiplier. Before, the future seemed grim for the expedition force of the evacuation army. Even though they numbered more than 2,000 soldiers, with 200 awakened and 4 masters ready to fight at the front, the enemy was just too domineering. The corrupted tyrant itself was tremendously dangerous. The army of bone monstrosities was no less threatening. However, both Effie and Kai were incredible sources of strength, acting as force multipliers for the whole regiment. With their help, the power of the soldiers soared, almost balancing the scale. Sunny's and Jet's efforts were no less important. Thanks to them, the two companies had been able to choose the battlefield and prepare an ambush. Terrain advantage was extremely valuable, and so was the foreknowledge of what the enemy was capable of. That last part was, perhaps, the most precious. The two scouts had not only gathered intelligence about the location of the enemy and the number of minions under its rule, they had also provided the analysts and diviners of the army with an opportunity to study the tyrant. Thanks to that, the human force did not have to go into the battle blind. Even though they did not know every detail of what the skull centipede was capable of, they did know the most important parts. For example, they knew that the confluence of the power that the giant abomination possessed was, surprisingly, hidden in the 2 dead skeletal trees that grew from its head, serving as the tyrant's crown and horns. In fact, Army Command had gone as far as to suggest that the true abomination was not the centipede itself, but the network of tree roots that permeated its monstrous skull, growing through the creature's brain matter. As such, the small army's first goal was to destroy one, or better yet both of these trees. Without them, the tyrant would most likely lose the ability to control its bone soldiers, as well as access to its most terrifying powers. But it was more easily said than done, and Sunny currently had other things to worry about because the centipede was going directly for him. Ignoring the squall of bullets and the rain of arrow, it rose from the river like a mountain of skulls and lunged straight at him, the giant maw opening like an abyssal gate. Sunny blinked. Are my flute skills really that atrocious? Listen, there's really no need to be that angry. A moment before the dreadful tyrant crashed into the boulder he was sitting on, Sunny leaned back and dissipated into the shadows. The centipede plunged down, shattering the ancient stone and turning it to dust. Stone shards and a great deal of dirt flew into the air, rising like a cloud. Sunny finished a backward roll much further up the slope, appearing behind the trenches and the mass of soldiers. He rose, flicked a few pieces of dust off his tunic, and glanced in the direction of the giant abomination. The skull centipede turned its head in the direction of the firing soldiers, its jaw still hanging open. Then, its enormous body tensed, ready to shoot forward. Before it could, however, something flashed through the air and impacted against the tyrant's head. The mysterious projectile was none other than Effie, who had used her own body as a siege ram. After rushing through the battlefield like a hurricane, she jumped and made her body into a ball, hiding it behind the round shield. When the dusk shards struck the tyrant, numerous skulls were instantly pulverized into bone dust. However, even more were revealed, becoming visible through the crack in the morbid carapace. The force of the impact was so tremendous that it not only slowed the centipede down, it actually threw the abomination back, pushing it back into the river. Effie herself was tossed to the ground and landed in a roll, jumping back to her feet a moment later. Her sculpted steel body did not look damaged at all. If anything, the huntress looked as exuberant and robust as ever. As her war cry resounded across the battlefield, the first wave of the hulking bone abominations clashed against the line of awakened. A ferocious melee exploded into a cacophony of ear-piercing noise. The tide of nightmare creatures seemed unstoppable, as if it would easily wash the human fighters away in a wave of desperation and blood, but it didn't. The first reason for that was Jet, who threw herself into the flood of abominations a few moments before the clash and broke the enemy's momentum. Her naginata easily passed through the layers of bone, destroying the rotten souls of the tyrant's minions. Both the bone puppets and Soul Reaper herself could be considered living dead. However, even among the dead, she was an exalted existence. The second reason was the awakened themselves. Even though most of the ghastly abominations were fallen, it barely looked as if there was a gap of power between them and the human fighters. Empowered by Raised by Wolves and emboldened by Nightingale, the soldiers fought with might and ferocity that was far beyond what they should have been capable of. It was really quite astonishing to see. Sunny shifted a little. Time for me to enter the fray as well, I guess. He had to act restrained in this battle. However, that did not mean that he couldn't do anything. More and more bone fiends were crawling out of the river, and the skull centipede itself had already recovered from Effie's devastating blow. It was lunging forward once again, this time aiming for the ironclad huntress. Sunny opened a leather satchel that hung on the silk cord tied around his waist, and took out a small, intricately engraved stone lantern. Then, he tossed it across the battlefield, aiming for the line where the shore met the cold water. As soon as the shadow lantern landed, it was as though all light was devoured from the wide area around it. Many bone abominations entered the sphere of darkness. However, none of them emerged again, as if swallowed by the shadows. Well, of course they didn't. After all, out there in the darkness, unseen, Saint was already waiting for them with the sin of solace in her hand. After unleashing her on the battlefield, Sunny concentrated on using shadow manifestation to reduce pressure on the soldiers. He tried not to destroy any of the bone abominations himself, maiming and suppressing them instead. Despite his efforts, however, a generous stream of shadow fragments poured into his soul, threatening to render him defenseless too soon. Sunny frowned, then looked in the direction where Effie was trying to distract the skull centipede and prevent it from reaching the trenches. She was holding the tyrant at bay, barely, for now. A dark grimace appeared on his face. It's all up to Kai then. High above the battlefield, hidden by the cold radiance of the sun, a small black dot was slowly growing larger. Chapter 1089, Falling Star. Effie was having a hard time standing her ground against the giant centipede. In fact, she was barely holding on. Even though a furious barrage of bullets, enchanted arrows, and magical projectiles was raining on the ghastly carapace of skulls, the abomination did not seem slowed down at all. Its massive body moved with dire speed, thousands of scythe-like legs tearing up the ground with each motion. The difference in size between the tyrant and the fearless huntress was just too big. Effie's only saving grace was that her body, despite being hundreds of times smaller than that of the ghastly centipede, seemed to contain truly astounding strength. She was incredibly swift and agile, as well, dashing around with stunning speed to dodge the crushing blows of the monstrous creature. Above everything else, the huntress was all but invulnerable. Her innate resilience was reinforced by two aspect abilities, and then strengthened by a transcendent armor on top of that. She had received several glancing blows from the abomination, which would have turned almost any other master into a broken corpse. Effie, however, was able to shake them off and continue to fight. Of course, there was no such thing as true invulnerability. The huntress was fine for now, but she was still dancing with death. The round shield she wielded possessed an enchantment called, which functioned similar to Sunny's own and allowed Effie to change its weight at will. Her spear was not able to deal serious wounds to the tyrant, but its strikes must have stung. Sunny saw the creature recoiling after the huntress managed to land a solid blow, all that allowed raised by wolves to tie down the skull centipede, at least for a short while. However, it did not mean that she would win. It took all Effie had to simply match the menace of the corrupted tyrant's massive body, all her abilities, all her skill, and all her powerful memories. While the abomination had not revealed any of its powers yet, once it did, the situation would inevitably change, and that moment had already come. As Sunny watched, Effie managed to push the centipede back once again. The shockwave of the impact threw her back as well. The huntress slid through the dirt, leaving 2 grooves in it. Her spear shot down, piercing the ground and bringing her to a sudden stop. A moment later, she was already lunging forward, ready to deliver another strike. However, the tyrant seemed to be fed up with their furious clash. The skull centipede raised its appalling head, the branches of the dead trees growing from the carapace of skulls swinging in the wind. Sunny's eyes widened slightly as he felt a sudden chill run down his spine. It was as though the wind that brushed against the skeletal branches was full of tormented whispers. A small black dot appeared in the air between the 2 trees. The dot warped and twisted, collapsing in on itself, and then began to grow, devouring the fabric of reality itself. It seemed as if an abyssal gate was starting to open in the air above the creature's head. Crap! Sunny instantly knew that nothing good was going to happen if the circle of darkness was allowed to finish forming. He made a move to step forward, but at that moment, a stream of light tore the sky asunder, falling from somewhere high above with inconceivable speed. It streaked across the battlefield like a flaming comet and crossed paths with the centipede's head, exploding with blinding radiance. A low boom resounded, followed by the sound of shattering wood. Kai had arrived. The plan of the battle the 4 masters had come up with assigned each of them an important role. Sunny was responsible for luring the tyrant to the ambush site and creating an obstacle for the bone fiends crawling out of the river. Jet was meant to lead the defenders and make sure that the trenches were not overrun. Effie's role was to stall the centipede and, more importantly, distract it. But it was Kai who was the key to their success or failure. The whole plan depended on whether the tyrant would be able to unleash its harrowing powers. To prevent it from happening and reduce the skull centipede to a mere giant beast, the trees growing from its head had to be destroyed. That was what Kai had to accomplish. He had hidden himself high in the sky and bid his time, waiting for an opportune moment. Then the archer plunged down, burning his essence and using gravity to reach truly astonishing speed. And now he delivered his attack, using that speed to close the trap they had set. The flaming comet was Kai himself, and he held a slender, shining saber in his hand. All of it happened in the blink of an eye. The streak of light crossed the creature's head, something flashed, and then a loud explosion boomed, washing over the battlefield. A split second later, Kai fell into the river. His speed was still so tremendous that he slid across the surface of the water without plunging into it, and only slowed down after being pushed 100 meters away from the shore. The head of the skull centipede, meanwhile, was flung to the side. One of the dead trees crowning it was completely shattered, its trunk exploding into thousands of sharp splinters. The circle of darkness collapsed and disappeared without a trace, never receiving the chance to fully form. Sunny let out a relieved sigh. It worked. The tyrant opened its maw, letting out a blood-chilling screech. The bone fiends trembled, becoming disorganized and somewhat sluggish. The soldiers roared with dark glee, invigorated by the sight of the giant creature losing one of its horns. Effie was already advancing, her spear ready to strike. Kai had managed to regain his balance and pushed himself off the surface of the water, shooting back into the sky and summoning his bow. A black arrow suddenly shot out of the cloud of darkness surrounding the shadow lantern. Empowered by Saint's transcended strength and the enchantment, the arrow struck the neck of the tyrant with harrowing force, annihilating layers of skulls and ripping a huge chunk of flesh out of it. However, Sunny did not pay any of it much attention, because right at that moment, the spell whispered into his ear. Malignant roots sapling. Sunny froze, his face turning deathly pale. Here we go again. The voice of the spell grew louder. Loud. Chapter 1090 Tyrant. Umasan ben more, willy, when to honor, incumbent, from one then, men, when the wenan, near an arm, anon, when near, men, ramana, mewanag. When Dagunan, Arnanwena, when Namdina, Mendamor, Men, Mad, when Damker, Menana, Hanomena, when Yania, when Mad, Mada, Terambendan, Nerd, Mendan Denda, Randa, Nanat, Mena, Rana, Mend, Anandamka, Minda, Mendan, Ryan, Menina, Menad, Mandan Denda, 20. Oh? Sunny did not have to summon the runes to know that he had finally accomplished his goal. After absorbing thousands of shadow fragments, his soul was ready to form a new shadow core, his fifth one. He was about to become a tyrant. A conflicting mess of emotions rose in his heart. Of course, Sunny felt a sense of joy and triumph. His power was about to take a significant jump, after all. The bleak, dreadful months he had spent in Antarctica, enduring hardships and grisly defeats, made this moment possible. In a sense, this was his reward, and so, the invisible scars he had been left with were not for nothing. On the other hand, this boon came at a very unfortunate moment. In the past, Sunny had been mostly able to time his advancements in a way that allowed him to go through the process in relatively safe conditions. A battlefield where hundreds of awakened were fighting against an army of fallen nightmare creatures and a corrupted tyrant, however, was in no way safe. And on top of that, he had already gone through this ordeal 3 times. He knew how much it was going to hurt. Hell yes, and also, damn it. Sunny glanced at the skull centipede, who was reeling from the dreadful blow dealt to it by Saint's arrow. A huge chunk of flesh was missing from its neck, with bone dust and rivers of fetid blood spilling into the river. Effie was moments away from reaching the wounded abomination, her sculpted steel body glistening in the sunlight, and Kai was preparing to draw his bow. One of the dead trees had been destroyed, which was supposed to rob the tyrant of its most terrible powers. However, the outcome of the fight was still far away from being set in stone. A corrupted tyrant was still a corrupted tyrant. Sunny felt that Effie, Kai, and Saint had a good chance of emerging victorious from that fight, but he couldn't be sure. Jet and the awakened soldiers were struggling to hold back the tide of bone fiends. Sadly, for now, there was nothing much Sunny could do to help them. The rest of the battle was up to others to win. As a hint of terrible pain appeared in his soul, Sunny hurriedly jumped backwards, hiding between 2 mounds of dug-up dirt. 2 figures emerged from his shadow. One was a fearsome black stallion, the other a scrawny little imp. He gritted his teeth and looked at his shadows. Protect me. Then, Sunny lingered for a moment and threw a glance at Nightmare. A cold smile appeared on his lips. Oh, and if the little bastard does something stupid, you have my permission to eat him, Nightmare. The dark destrier snorted in calm agreement, while the imp stared at him with shocked outrage and fear. Sunny grinned, then turned white as a sheet and swayed. His hand rose, grabbing at his chest. This is the worst. A familiar, but no less dreadful agony overwhelmed his entire being. Sunny was momentarily blinded and deafened, losing all sense of the world around him. Something was rising from the depths of his soul, tearing at it with sharp edges. The torment of it was nothing short of exquisite. He had experienced this pain several times before. Human souls were not supposed to possess many cores. Neither were they able to sustain them. It was only because of Sunny's divine aspect that his soul had become stronger, growing vast and powerful enough to endure the strain. Nevertheless, this was not in its nature. Therefore, the birth of a new core brought with it immeasurable pain, with each successive one hurting more. The first time Sunny had gone through the process, he had been rendered absolutely helpless, thrashing on the ground and wailing like a dying beast. The second time had brought him to his knees, making his screams echo in the desolate halls of the ruined Chalice Temple. The third time Sunny had managed to remain silent, up to the point when the body of the shadow spawn he had been occupying started to change too. The pain had grown more intense with each new core, but Sunny had also grown more resilient. He had been through so much and had experienced so much, the journey through the endless procession of nightmares alone would have been enough to drive anyone mad. And so, this time, Sunny endured. He did not fall down, remaining on his feet. He did not scream. He did, however, lose all track of time and of what was happening around him. All that remained was agonizing pain and the sensation of something being born within his soul. It lasted for an eternity. But then, eventually, the eternity had ended. Sunny realized that he could hear again. He knew that because he heard the voice of the spell whisper into his ear softly, "Your shadow is complete." And, mercifully, the pain ended. He inhaled deeply, trembling. He felt stronger. His body had become stronger. His reserves of essence had grown the most, by far. Most importantly, he was now in possession of the fifth shadow. And he was a tyrant. A tyrant. Sunny exhaled. A complicated emotion grasped his heart. Finally, after years of struggling and chasing after something that often seemed unreachable, he had caught up with Nephis. Sure, she was still ahead of him by a sizable amount of fragments, but they were of the same class now. They were both ascended tyrants. Strangely enough, Sunny did not care too much. He had wanted desperately to be as strong as Changing Star once. There had been a lot of reasons for him to harbor that desire, some better, some worse, and now that he had reached that goal, Sunny knew that his former understanding of what real strength was had been terribly misguided, and so he did not really care. Still, it felt nice to be equal to her on paper, even if what was written in shimmering runes was not that important. Now, for the important stuff. Sunny shifted, turning his head to observe the battlefield. There was another tyrant nearby, and that tyrant posed a threat to his friends and the soldiers, so the creature had to be dealt with. Chapter 1091, Fifth Shadow. Sunny was still reeling from having his soul torn apart, then sewn back together. However, the battle was raging, so he had no time to recover in peace. That was fine. He was long used to fighting in the most dire conditions anyway. It took him only a moment to assess the situation. It seemed that he had been out of it for quite some time. The battlefield was ravaged and upturned, with the river itself slightly changing course. Its water, which had been clear once, now seemed muddy and noxious. Effie and Kai were still fighting the ghastly centipede in the shallows, with Saint supporting them from the darkness. The three seemed to be doing fine. The soldiers, however, were straining to hold their ground. The slope of the river shore was littered with shattered bones, and hundreds of the tyrant's abominable minions had already been destroyed. But there were hundreds more, and now that Saint was busy turning the skull centipede into a pincushion and weighing it down with the help of the enchantment of Morgan's warbow, there was no one to serve as the wave breaker against their tide. There was only Jet. Soul Reaper moved like the beautiful visage of death among the bone fiends, erasing one after another from existence. But she was just one woman. No matter how fast and lethal, she couldn't be in several places at the same time. Sunny hesitated, trying to make a decision. His instinct was to go for the biggest threat, personally removing it from the equation. However, the tyrant was still strong and ferocious. Even without most of its powers, the centipede was putting up a dreadful fight. It was hard to say how long it would take to bring it down. The soldiers, meanwhile, would continue to suffer under the onslaught of the bone fiends until it did. So what was he supposed to do? Follow his habits and race to kill the tyrant, or act against instinct and put his trust in Effie and Kai, concentrating on reinforcing the ordinary soldiers instead? Sunny sighed. Instincts are great, but humans rose above beasts, and thanks to reason. In the end, no matter how unnatural it felt, he could do no better than to follow the plan. The role he had been assigned was to lure the tyrant to the ambush, and then put obstacles in the path of the Bone Army to make it easier on the awakened and the mundane soldiers. So, Sunny was going to put himself between the abominations and the humans. Before lunging into the fray, he dismissed Nightmare and the little imp. They had already done their job by guarding him. Throwing the two into the mass of fallen enemies would do more harm than good. Then Sunny glanced down at the shadows gathered on the ground in front of him. The first four were his old companions, the gloomy, happy, creepy, and haughty fellows. The fifth one, however, was new. The fifth shadow seemed naive and good-natured. Even though it was not as boisterous, the guy resembled the happy shadow a little bit too much. So much, in fact, that Sunny couldn't help but feel that its amicable disposition was just a front. And behind that front he could sense a hint of boundless deviousness. The shadow was up to no good. It was clearly full of all kinds of mischief. He raised his eyebrow and sighed. "You're a naughty one, aren't you?" The naughty shadow stared at him, radiating nothing but innocent surprise. Eventually, the shadow shook its head with utter sincerity. It seemed a little hurt. It was as though the shadow was saying, "Who? Me? Oh no, of course not. I would never." Sonny squinted his eyes. Yeah, right. Well, let's go then. I don't know if you've noticed, but we're in the middle of a battle." The shadow looked at him, then scratched the back of its head and glanced at its siblings, as if unsure what to do. When the other four shadows moved forward to wrap themselves around his body, though, it quickly followed. A feeling of overflowing strength permeated Sonny's body. He inhaled deeply, getting used to his new limits, then caught sight of Effie breaking a dozen of the tyrant's legs with her round shield. Instantly, his limits were expanded even further. Sonny smiled, summoned the cruel sight, and dashed forward. At the same time, he used the bless to establish a mental bond with Jet and coordinate their movements. She moved to her right. Soul Reaper was going to be responsible for the western half of the defensive line, while Devil was going to rampage in the eastern part. Shadows surged forward. In the next moment, the sound of breaking bones rolled over the battlefield. In the end, it was Kai who brought down the skull centipede. Saint had debilitated and slowed it down with her arrows, which gave Effie an opportunity to deliver a devastating blow to the creature's head, cracking its skull. Of course, that alone would have never killed a corrupted tyrant. However, it did give Kai a chance to deal a fatal strike to the ghastly abomination. Flying across the sky, he positioned himself above the centipede and drew his bow. This time, an arrow of incinerating flame appeared on its string. The heat of the arrow was so dreadful that it seemed as if the world itself was melting around it. Luckily, Kai was protected by the armor made from the scales of a dragon. Unaffected by the immolating heat, he let the fiery arrow loose. It flew down like a streak of light, entering the creature's skull through the thin crack. Then, a dreadful explosion illuminated the tyrant's head from the inside. Tongues of flames and streams of smoke shot from its mouth, from the pit where the broken tree had been, and from the empty eyes of the countless skulls. The centipede's own indestructible, giant skull seemed as if it was going to burst open for a moment. But in the end, it didn't. Trailing smoke and fire from its head, the creature swayed, and then heavily crashed to the ground. The skull centipede was dead. With the tyrant gone, its minions lost all remaining cohesion. Effie, Kai, and Saint were also freed to attack them from behind. Caught between them and the main body of the expedition force, the Bone Army swiftly dwindled. It wasn't long before it was completely annihilated. Looking at the battlefield, which was covered in broken bones, Sonny took a deep breath. "I can't believe it. A plan actually worked. I think that's a first." Chapter 1092, Expeditious Retreat. The battle was over, but the soldiers had no time to relax and celebrate their victory. They did not even have time to collect the soul shards and other spoils from the army of slain abominations. Instead, as soon as the fighting ended, everyone got busy preparing for an immediate retreat. That was the nature of the war in Antarctica. No matter what terrible of a foe you defeated, a dozen more were just beyond the horizon. They were in enemy territory. The ferocious battle against the skull centipede had not taken a lot of time, but it had created a lot of noise. Already, several hordes of nightmare creatures were flowing across the plain, converging on the location where the battle had taken place. Unless the expedition force wanted to drown in an endless flood of abominations, it needed to disappear as soon as possible. Sonny, Jet, Effie, and Kai were gathered in front of the skull centipede's massive corpse, careful to steer clear of the water. They did not know what the poison was exactly, but the river was visibly tainted. Even in death, the corrupted tyrant continued to spread death and destruction. They had just retrieved the 5 transcendent soul shards from the ghastly carcass. That was the extent of the trophies the expedition force was going to carry back with it. The huntress looked at the hundreds of dead abominations laying on the ground and sighed. Damn, what a pity. That would be enough for an entire cohort of sleepers to saturate their cores. Sonny felt a bit regretful too. The monetary value of all these shards would have been astronomical. Granted, now that the chain of nightmare had flooded the waking world with abominations, the price of shards was not what it had been before. He knew it from his occasional correspondence with Aiko. He shook his head. That might be true, but what's the use of having all these shards if we die before reaching a siege capital? Kai nodded. Indeed, we have already reaped the main benefit, preventing the tyrant from growing stronger and reaching one of the human settlements. Our casualties were light, too. That's a win in my book. Anything else is irrelevant. Sonny knew that his friend was right, but nevertheless he could not help but sigh with regret. At least his luck had been good, granting him several ascended memories. None seemed particularly useful, so he promptly fed them to Nightmare. That was already a good result for one day. After a short pause, Sonny said, "In any case, good job, everyone. That went much smoother than I thought it would. Especially you, Kai. That was an insane shot." Sonny knew a thing or two about archery. Shooting an arrow through a thin crack in the skull of a moving target, while flying at high speed, that was one for the books. The charming archer had been the one to destroy the skeletal trees, as well. Kai smiled shyly. "Thank you. To be honest, I can't quite believe it. I never thought that I would kill a corrupted tyrant one day." His green eyes turned slightly wistful, as if he was recalling the past. Sonny blinked a couple of times. "What on earth are you talking about? Can't believe it," says the guy who jumped into the mouth of a dragon to kill it. Kai coughed, while Jet glanced at him and raised an eyebrow. "A dragon? What kind of a dragon are we talking about?" The archer shook his head. "It was just a transformed saint in the Nightmare." This time, it was Soul Reaper's turn to blink. "Ascended Nightingale killed a saint?" Her voice sounded a little dull. Effie suddenly laughed. "What about it? I killed one too, a huge pain of a bastard. And that one," she pointed at Sonny, "he actually killed the same saint twice. Speak about holding grudges." Jet rubbed the back of her neck with a neutral expression. And I thought my second nightmare was exciting." At that moment, Kai turned his head slightly, as if listening to something. He was most likely receiving a message through his comm. And indeed, a few moments later, he called out to them, "Everything is ready. We can depart in 3 minutes." Sonny let out a relieved sigh. The two companies had been quick to organize themselves for a rapid march, and so they would be able to leave before any of the migrating hordes arrived. Kai looked at Sonny and Jet, then at Effie. Then he asked hesitantly, "Ooh, are we going to take my ride or yours?" Effie scoffed. "Does it matter?" She grinned and answered her own question a moment later. "Of course it matters. Do you think that I don't know how pampered you are by your soldiers? That guy, it's really unfair. He has a fan club even in the army. They bring him all kinds of little gifts, including snacks and sweets. So I think we need to celebrate, and I think you're treating." Kai looked away in embarrassment. Those aren't gifts. People are just concerned about their commander. I can't really refuse, either. They become sad if I do." Sonny grinned. Whatever you say." The archer shook his head. "All right, then we will ride in my APC. We can work on compiling a report for Army Command in the process, too." With nothing more to discuss, they hurried to leave the scene of the battle. Riding a personnel carrier at the head of a column of soldiers made Sonny remember the cold, dark days in the Antarctic Center. Granted, Kai's APC was a little shabby when compared to the robust, beautiful Rhino. Still, it got the job done, and the charming archer really had some delicious stuff squirreled away in the nooks and crannies of the heavy machine. The expedition force left the ravaged river shore behind and rushed across the plain, escaping the approaching mass of nightmare creatures. They masterfully navigated the landscape, avoiding the wandering swarms and keeping out of sight as well as they could. The column had to fight off a few packs of abominations, but these skirmishes were too inconsequential to pay them any attention. Things like that were unavoidable when a large force traveled across Antarctica. Everything was going well. But, of course, it had not gone well for long. At some point, the loud sound of an emergency message rolled through the interior of the APC. Sonny looked up and turned to the communication terminal, frowning. As soon as the damned thing lit up, he knew that something had gone really, really wrong. Chapter 1093, Perfect Moment. The APC was a little cramped, but the four masters were able to make themselves comfortable. They were sitting on empty ammunition crates, enjoying some of the snacks Kai had presented them with. The mood in the interior of the armored vehicle was surprisingly relaxed, and the awakened crew under the archer's command were respectfully giving them some space. Effie was talking. Wait, what? That is hilarious." The conversation had taken a random turn, leading to Kai sharing the details of how he and Sonny first met. At the time, one of them had been imprisoned in a deep well, while the other had gone more than a little feral after living alone in the dark city. The huntress knew what had happened in broad strokes, but this was her first time hearing the full story. She couldn't stop laughing. "I can just imagine it." Effie wiped her eyes, then glanced at Jet and asked with curiosity, "What about you, Colonel? How did you become Sonny's fairy godmother?" Soul Reaper smiled, leaning back with a can of a refreshing beverage in her hand. "What's a fairy grandmother? Is it some kind of nightmare creature? Effie stared at her for a few moments, then shook her head despondently. What's a fairy go? Damn, they really are two peas in the same pod. Jet chuckled. I guess not. Well, there's not much of a story. I've been assigned to hold vigil over an aspirant, and that aspirant turned out to be Sunny. It's rare for us kids from the outskirts to survive the first nightmare, so I kept in touch. Sunny let out a relieved sign when he realized that she wasn't going to describe the exact moment he had woken up and what transpired right after. There was no need to give Effie more ammunition. If Jet spilled the beans, he would never hear the end of it. He opened his mouth to change the topic, but at that moment, the sound of an urgent message resounded in the interior of the APC. Sunny did not like that sound at all. Looking up at the communication terminal, he frowned. Almost at the same time, his own comm vibrated, receiving a message as well. As Kai rose to access the terminal, the other three checked their comms. The messages Sunny and Jet had received were probably a little different, since the Special Reconnaissance Unit was privy to more information, but the gist of it was the same. Damnation. Sunny glanced at his friends, reading the same somber tension on their faces. The chain of nightmares had just gone into another period of rapid escalation. Dozens of gates had opened across East Antarctica at the same time, and the initial readings showed that most, if not all of them, were of the third category. Much worse, it had already been confirmed that several Titans had emerged, ready to wreak havoc across the continent. Even though the Three Saint had slayed several such creatures in the past months, the situation was still eerily similar to what had happened in the Antarctic Center. Would the entirety of the evacuation army be able to handle the sudden crisis? Sunny was not sure. Their chances were much higher than what the Antarctic Center contingents had been. But still, things had just gone from bad to worse. Jet sighed. More Titans, huh? I wonder if any of them are corrupted. Effie continued to munch on her snack, seemingly unbothered by the dire news. She simply shrugged. We'll find out soon enough. There is no point in worrying about it now, is there? Soul Reaper grinned. True. Well, unless one of those Titans happened to appear right between us and the siege capital. The Huntress suddenly stopped chewing, which was very abnormal behavior in her case, and glared at Jet silently. Colonel Jet, you just had to go and say it, didn't you? At that moment, Kai returned from the terminal with a troubled face. He looked at them for a few moments, then sighed. There has been a change of plans. The path we were supposed to take back is no longer available, so Army Command sent orders to reroute the expedition force. We will be retreating to a different city, to be stationed there until further notice. Effie sighed and shook her head despondently. See, Sunny and Jet glanced at each other. They had not received new orders, so the SRU still expected them to accompany the two companies. That was a relief. Kai turned to them and forced out a smile. Sunny ascended Jet. We will have to trouble you with helping us navigate the wilderness, as well as provide help to our scouts. I hope you don't mind. If everything goes well, we'll be behind walls in 3 days. Sunny looked around. Why would we mind? This is like a luxury hotel. I haven't been fed this much delicious stuff in a while. A small smile appeared on his face. Kai nodded. Great, then please excuse me. I'll go arrange for the column to change course. He went back to the communication terminal, leaving the three of them alone. Sunny sighed, the smile disappearing from his face. This is it then. A perfect moment. 2 days passed in a tense but manageable atmosphere. The expedition force was persisting in its march, traversing the Great Plains of East Antarctica with acceptable speed. The skirmishes they fought increased in frequency and ferocity, but with Sunny's shadows scouting out the way, they were able to escape major battles. The rest of the continent was not doing as well. East Antarctica was in turmoil, with the assaults on the siege capitals growing more dreadful every day. The evacuation army was holding for now, but the future seemed grim. At the same time, the Saint had united to face the rampaging Titans. Their battle had lasted for several ruinous hours and ended in a bitter draw. 2 of the Titans perished, but the Transcendent had to retreat, each sustaining heavy wounds. Several more creatures remained, including 1 confirmed corrupted Titan. For now, none of them was actively moving toward the siege capitals, but it was only a matter of time. Bad. This smells really bad. Sunny was at the back of Kai's APC, sitting on a crate with his eyes closed. His shadows were out scouting, and Jet was sleeping on a neighboring crate, using a military coat as a blanket. Suddenly, her communicator produced a melodic sound. Since it was not a notification from Army Command, Sunny paid it no attention. Soul Reaper, however, sat up, yawned, and glanced at the message with a sullen expression. She remained silent for a few moments, then grimaced and showed him the screen of the communicator. Sunny opened his eyes and read the title of a government propaganda article attached to the message. His eyes turned a little darker. The title read, "The Great Legacy Clans announce full support for the Southern Quadrant evacuation effort. In humanity's hour of need, its greatest warriors are rising against the forces of the Nightmare spell. The best of Bastion and Ravenheart are already en route to reinforce the valiant soldiers of the evacuation army." Chapter 1094, Wake of Ruin. Sunny remained silent for a long time, then leaned back with a sigh. His thoughts were dark and heavy. Deep in his heart, an ember of anger smoldered, divorced from all reason, pushing him to do dangerous and short-decided things. It was almost as if the sin of Solace was whispering into his ears. Kill them all. How hard would it be to simply kill them all? Probably not much easier than slaying the winter beast, and with much more dire consequences. Shaking his head, he looked at Jet. They had never spoken about it directly, but she definitely knew the real reason why the great clans were coming to Antarctica. After all, Soul Reaper had a much more extensive information network. She was deeply embedded into the hierarchy of the government and had a personal connection to some of its leaders. Of course, the government was only a second-rate player in the grand scheme of things. Still, they played an important role, and as such, had access to a lot of secrets. He lingered for a few moments. "What do you think will happen now?" Jet covered her mouth with a hand, yawned, and then smiled. "Right now? Well, let me think. I guess the first thing that will happen is that I am going to receive a message from the old man." Just as she finished the sentence, her communicator lit up, displaying a new notification. Soul Reaper chuckled quietly, then concentrated on the screen of the military-issue device. "See, it's a curse, to always be right. Give me a minute." Sunny waited for her to finish reading the important message, and it was important indeed. The old man Jet had mentioned was none other than Saint Cor, the Wake of Ruin, one of the two government transcendents. Sunny had met him briefly after coming to East Antarctica, and the man definitely left an impression. Wake of Ruin was a tall, gaunt man in his late 50s. Although his skin was showing signs of aging, his hair still remained perfectly black, like the feathers of a raven. The saint had sharp features, a piercing gaze, and a stern demeanor, acting like a person who was used to both wielding power and bearing responsibility. Wherever he went, a slightly sweet, sickening scent followed. Sunny was intimately familiar with that scent. It reminded him of the smell of the battlefield, or rather, of what remained after the battle was over. Saint Cor was not a likable person. However, it was hard not to feel respect toward him. The government transcendent was not as renowned and awesome as the saints of the legacy clans. In fact, for a saint, he was strangely low-key, but his age alone told volumes about what kind of man he was and what ordeals he had lived through. Wake of Ruin was not quite in the same league as the legendary figures like Immortal Flame and Nightwalker, since he had been a young child when the spell first descended. However, he was still a member of the first generation, and as such had watched and helped build the world order of today. Even if Saint Cor had become transcendent later than the members of the second generation like Anvil and Ki Song, he was still, in a sense, their elder. Sunny did not know what the arrangement between the government and the great clans was exactly, but the mere fact that Wake of Ruin was allowed to be the exclusion from the rule and did not serve any of the sovereigns hinted that there was more to the old man than appeared on the surface. He was the field commander of the whole Antarctica operation, and Jet seemed to enjoy quite a close relationship with the veteran saint. She was one of his most trusted agents. So, it wasn't a surprise that Soul Reaper would be one of the first people to be contacted by Wake of Ruin after the news of the legacy forces coming to the southern quadrant were made public. Lucky me, Sunny did not have close ties to the upper echelons of the government, but as Soul Reaper's confidant, he would be privy to the vital information almost as soon as she. Come to think of it, he also had eyes and ears inside Valor thanks to Nephis and Cassie, and enjoyed the friendship of one of the heirs of the House of Night. He even had a bond with Saint Bloodwave and was friendly with the White Feather clan. I guess I am better connected than I thought I was. And that was without even considering his venerated status in the evacuation army. Waiting for Jet to finish reading the message, Sunny grinned. Maybe I should seduce one of Sishan's sisters, just to complete the trifecta. Those women from the great clan Song, Ki Song's adopted daughters, were all a bit scary though. Well, there's Mordred as well. The naughty shadow gave him a sly glance, making Sunny blink a couple of times. What? What the hell are you on about? I didn't mean it that way. I was talking about befriending the bastard, not seducing him. The shadow tilted its head. If it had a face, there would have been an innocent smile on its lips, and sparks of dubious sincerity in its eyes. Sonny gritted his teeth. Damnation. I've only known you for a couple of days, but I am already starting to regret it. What is wrong with you, miscreant? Look at the other guys. None of them were ever problematic. To prove his point, Sonny gestured in the direction where the other shadows were, diligently scouting out the path for the column. He could vividly imagine their reactions, though. The gloomy shadow would cross its arms, as if trying to say, "Who are you pointing at, you idiot?" The happy shadow would nod energetically, expressing something like, "Of course, we would never cause problems to our master. Master, you're the best," with all its being. The creepy shadow would stare at him with its usual creepy inexpressiveness, but its thoughts would be easy to guess. It would probably be something like, "I wonder what it would feel like to slice the new guy open. What do his insides look like? What is the texture? Do shadows have insides? I want to know." The haughty shadows would wear its usual arrogant look, radiating the "keep me out of this plebeian conversation" peasant feeling with its disdainful pose. The naughty shadow glanced at Sonny with amusement. Sonny sighed. All right, point taken. Chapter 1095, High Praise. Eventually, Jet put away her communicator and stared into the distance for a few moments, thinking. Then she turned to Sonny. He asked, "So, what's the word?" Soul Reaper had a contemplative look on her face. "The good news is that we're getting reinforcements. Both Valor and Song are sending strong contingents. 2 saints each, a handful of masters, and a supporting retinue of hundreds of awakened. All of them the absolute elites of the legacy clans, of course. Some direct descendants, some loyal retainers. You can imagine how powerful of a force that is." Sonny nodded. Despite his animosity toward the great clans, and those legacies that served them, even he had to admit that these people had not ended up in the position of highest power by accident. Legacies were born and bred to be perfect warriors, and in that pursuit they were ruthless both to their enemies and to themselves. An awakened from a legacy clan was worth their weight in soul shards on the battlefield. It was only when compared to the survivors of the Forgotten Shore that they did not seem that exceptional. But the former dreamers of the Dark City were an abnormality themselves. Hundreds of Legacy Awakened could achieve a lot in East Antarctica, but whatever they could do paled in comparison to the arrival of 4 more saints. That was the real game changer, more than doubling the number of transcendents present in the southern quadrant in one swoop. With 7 saints leading the charge, the position of the evacuation army would be tremendously bolstered. That was if the newcomers had any intention of helping the evacuation effort along, and not just thwarting it. He looked at Jet with a gloomy expression. "What's the bad news, then?" She shrugged. "Well, the great clans have their own plans. They are going to have to keep up appearances, at least, but who knows what they really have in mind." Sonny remained silent for a while, then nodded slowly. "And what is the government going to do about it?" Jet laughed. "You really think they would send such information in a message? I mean, the military network is supposed to be protected, but come on." He thought about it, then shook his head. Soul Reaper chuckled. "In any case, we'll know more soon. I've been informed that the legacy forces will be arriving in 2 batches. The second one is already sailing across the ocean, carrying most of them, 2 separate naval convoys, of course. Otherwise, gods know what would happen." She lingered for a moment. "The second, smaller batch will be arriving much earlier, though. They'll be here in no more than a couple of days, coming through the Dream Realm. The vanguard consists of 2 saints and 4 masters, from what I've been told. And what a coincidence. They'll be coming directly to the siege capital we're heading for." Sonny smiled slightly. "Is it really a coincidence?" Jet shook her head. "Of course not. Kor is actually already there, assembling a welcoming party. He kindly requested for me to participate. Oh, and he asked me to bring you along." Sonny looked at her with surprise, a frown appearing on his face. "What? Wake of Ruin singled me out directly?" He raised an eyebrow. "Me? Why does he want me, of all people, to be there? I don't even work for the government, really. There are certainly better candidates." Soul Reaper smiled and shook her head. "Because you're one of the deadliest masters on the planet, Sonny. And, more importantly, you are not affiliated to any of the legacy clans. At this point, Kor would have to be crazy not to try and use you as an asset." Sonny felt pleased to receive her praise, but not at all happy with the contents of that praise. He leaned back and crossed his arms. "And what if I don't want to be used?" Jet laughed. "Well, you can always go away and live as a hermit in the Dream Realm. Other than that, my advice is to get comfortable being used." She thought for a bit and then added, "But not too comfortable. Make sure to use the people using you in response, at least. Sunny blinked a couple of times. What the hell kind of perverse wisdom is that? He scoffed. That's either a very profound or an entirely shameless statement. Soul Reaper grinned. Ah, it's probably both. But anyway, that's for the future. We have to get to the siege capital first. And with how things are going, that might be a bit of a problem. Sunny grew serious. Jet was right. For the past 2 days, things went more or less well for the expedition force. But the last day was bound to be the most difficult, because they were leaving the wilderness and approaching the area surrounding a human settlement. By nature of the chain of nightmares, these areas were the most dangerous on the continent. A constant stream of abominations was flowing toward the siege capitals to lay assault their walls, and the closer one got to a city, the higher the concentration of nightmare creatures was. Fighting a pitched battle was inevitable if the expedition force wanted to reach the gates of the human stronghold. Yeah, let's make sure that everything goes smoothly first. We can worry about legacies later. The immediate task might now have been as grandiose, but it was a priority right now. Jet had given up on sleep, and Sunny felt sufficiently rested. They left their corner of the APC and joined Kai on its roof. The archer was alone, quietly studying a bow made of dark, ashen wood. The weapon radiated an eerie aura of nebulous power, alienation, and lethality. What a dreadful thing. Sunny waved at him. New memory? Kai looked away from the bow and forced out a smile. Yeah, I received it for slaying the malignant grave root. It's a daunting bow to use, to be honest. Sunny wanted to ask to take a look at the ashen bow, but at that moment, a loud roar resounded from somewhere up ahead, and Effie's voice came in through their comms. Ah, damn it. That swarm Sunny scouted an hour ago. They're coming sooner than we expected. Get ready. Sunny, Jet, and Kai glanced at each other, then sighed, summoning their best memories. The last day, indeed, was promising to be really troublesome. Chapter 1096, Murder of Crows. They defeated the swarm. However, the smell of the blood attracted a migrating horde, so the expedition force had to fight their way through the flood of nightmare creatures as well. Eventually, the column broke free and escaped into the vast plain, but the peace was short-lived. Very soon, they had to fight another skirmish, which grew into another battle, which grew into an unending onslaught of enemies that threw themselves on the speeding vehicles without reprieve. The mundane soldiers fought admirably. Although not as experienced as the veterans of the First Army, these men and women had also tasted their fair share of bloodshed and strife. Everyone was calm and collected, performing their duties with deadly efficiency and poise. Their performance was immaculate, and their morale seemed unshakable. Was it because the Second Army had not lived through the same hopelessness as the soldiers in the Antarctic Center? Or was it because Effie and Kai were able to inspire them better than Sunny had been able to inspire his soldiers? He was not sure. Regardless, the wolves and the night singers were a spirited bunch. The awakened were as resolute as the mundanes. Although fewer in number, the impact they had on the battlefield was immeasurably higher. All kinds of aspects worked in harmony to create an impenetrable death zone around the column. The abominations that managed to survive it were promptly dispatched by the melee fighters. And, of course, the influence of the four masters was even greater still. Effie was serving as the vanguard of the expedition force, cutting a bloody path for the vehicles to follow. Her lustrous figure weaved through the mass abominations, leaving devastation in its wake. The bodies of the creatures she killed were left crumbled and broken, as if an invisible colossus had crushed them under its feet as it walked across the vast plain. The blows raining on her sculpted steel body, in turn, rang against metal without ever slowing her down. Kai was soaring high in the sky, observing the rolling battlefield in its entirety and taking out the most dangerous creatures before they could approach the column. His arrows seemed to have a mind of their own, unfailingly slipping through the tiniest cracks in the armor of the abominations. Usually, one arrow was all it took to bring even the most fearsome creature down. His secondary role was to protect the expedition force from the aerial attacks, and in that task, the archer performed admirably as well. Jet was protecting the rear of the column, holding the pursuing enemies back. Her throwing stars fell like iron hail, seemingly numerous. Each carried the same dreadful ability as her melee attacks, striking directly at the soul cores of the abominations. Such a manner of fighting was bound to burn through essence with terrible speed, but that was what made Soul Reaper Jet so frightening of an opponent. As long as she kept killing, her essence would never run out, and in such a furious battle, Jet was free to slaughter as many enemies as she could. And finally, there was Sunny. He was sitting on the roof of an APC with his eyes closed, controlling numerous shadows. All across the column, inky black hands made of darkness appeared out of nowhere to protect the soldiers and press nightmare creatures down into the ground, making them easy to slaughter. For now, there had not been a single casualty thanks to the watchful shadows. Keeping the whole expedition force safe was not easy. In fact, the length of the column was well beyond the reach of his shadow sense, and therefore, out of the area where he could use shadow manifestation. But Sunny was using a little trick. He had stationed his 5 shadows throughout the column, each serving as an island of his consciousness. His senses and his ability to control wild shadows were extended manifold that way. He could summon Saint to help out too. But for now, Sunny was holding back from calling upon the taciturn night. The truth of the matter was that he wanted to keep her existence hidden. More or less everyone who had learned of their connection in the Antarctic Center were either dead now or could be trusted to keep the secret. Here in East Antarctica, he had mostly acted alone in the wilderness or side by side with Jet, so Saint had not been exposed. The only exception was Song Se-shan, but she had last seen the taciturn night in the catacombs below the Dark City. Saint had changed a lot since then, both visually and in terms of rank. Connecting her past and present self would be almost impossible. As for the legend of Mongrel, no one knew who he was and where he had come from in the first place. More than that, after the events of Falcon Scott, many people believed that Mongrel had fallen heroically while protecting the last siege capital. From what Sunny had heard, there was already an epic propaganda film about the life and tragic sacrifice of the mysterious swordsman being cooked up back in the NQSC. He shuddered at the thought. In any case, Sunny was handling the battle fine for now, and he wanted to keep Saint as his hidden ace for a while. That was why he had only summoned her within the sphere of darkness created by the Shadow Lantern during the battle against the malignant Grave Root. Although, I'm not sure if I can keep this up much longer. As the siege capital drew nearer, the onslaught of the nightmare creatures only grew more intense. Sunny was already struggling, and his reserves of essence were swiftly reducing. Something had to change, and soon it did. He smelled it before he felt it. A sweet, sickening scent was suddenly carried over by the wind. Then, the battlefield was suddenly shrouded in a vast shadow. Sunny opened his eyes and looked up at the thing that had blotted out the sun. Above them, a myriad of crows filled the sky. There were numerous thousands of them, all circling like a giant whirlwind of darkness. As he watched, the countless crows pivoted with eerie synchronicity and dove down. Their black beaks and vicious talons emanated a sense of deadly sharpness. The myriad of crows was Wake of Ruin. That was his transformation. What came in the wake of a bloody battle? A swarm of carrion birds. The Saint had arrived to guide them into the city personally. Chapter 1097, Special Envoys. Ever since coming to Antarctica, Sunny had been to so many underground strongholds and attended so many meetings in windowless rooms that all of them started to blend together. They all looked the same and felt the same. Even the people inside the room started to seem the same after a while. This time, however, he found himself in a stately and luxurious hall, which was a nice change of pace. The interior was tasteful, but lavish. The tall windows let in natural sunlight. The filtered air was cool, crisp, and fresh. What was there not to like? He was relaxing in a comfortable chair, idly waiting for Wake of Ruin to arrive. Jet was nearby, in a similarly laid-back pose. The Transcendent had summoned them immediately after the expedition force had reached the siege capital, and yet he was running late. Neither of them minded. They had barely had time to wash the dirt of the road off themselves before coming to the spacious hall. After weeks spent in the wilderness of East Antarctica, every moment of leisurely peace was like a precious gift. Sunny was lazily thinking about the outcome of the latest battle. After the swarm of crows had descended on the nightmare creatures, hundreds of them were torn apart in an instant, and the slaughter did not stop until the column was safely behind the city walls. The sight of it was frightening and magnificent in equal measure. What a powerful transformation. Of course, he wouldn't go so far as to say that Wake of Ruin's transcendent form was more powerful than that of, for example, Saint Tyrus. Rather, they were best suited for different tasks. The government saint excelled in battles against large numbers of nightmare creatures or potent adversaries that did not possess a lot of physical defense. He was also extremely hard to kill, since that would require exterminating every single one of the myriad of crows, although there would probably be some repercussions for Saint Cor if the swarm sustained heavy losses. Skytide, on the other hand, could deliver a much more dire punishment to a single powerful enemy. Her ability to control wind and lightning also made her a more versatile and well-rounded saint. Sunny tried to imagine what would happen if the two transcendents clashed. The mental image of a giant thunderbird being swarmed by a vast whirlwind of black crows in the dark skies was truly an awesome one. Who would win? He was not sure. Saint Tyrus would be at a slight disadvantage due to being robbed of one of her trump cards. True, she often relied on aerial superiority to slay her foes, but then again, Saint Cormac had also been a flying beast. That had not prevented her from tearing off his wyvern head. Jet glanced at Sunny and smiled. "You're thinking about murder again, aren't you?" He turned his head and gave her an impassive look. "Yes. Why?" Soul Reaper laughed. "No reason." Sunny studied her with a contemplative expression. Come to think of it, her crow echo was a strange one. Was there, perhaps, a connection between it and the Saint of Carrion Birds? He wanted to ask, but at that moment the doors of the palatial hall opened, and Wake of Ruin himself walked in, looking as tall and gaunt as ever. A subtle scent of rot and slaughter followed the old man like an invisible mantle. Saint Cor was wearing an austere military uniform that had an insignia of 4 stars emblazoned on its sleeve. His sharp, pale face was framed by unruly raven-black hair, and his dark eyes were staring at them with bleak dullness. When he looked at Jet, however, a hint of cold fondness appeared in the weathered lines of his unfriendly face. "Soul Reaper, Ascended Sunless, welcome." His voice was hoarse and a bit grating. They had both stood up when the saint walked in, so he gestured for them to sit. Then, Wake of Ruin took a chair opposite them. "How did your last mission go?" They glanced at each other. Jet was the one to respond. "It was all right, sir. We scouted out a corrupted tyrant, met up with the wolves and the night singer, and helped them take the creature down. Casualties were minimal." He nodded, seemingly indifferent to the news of a powerful creature being slain, which was only expected. As the field commander of the entire operation, Saint Cor must have been receiving reports like this quite frequently. His next question, however, was a bit surprising. "How do you like it in the SRU?" Jet lingered for a moment. "I like it just fine, sir." The old man shifted his gaze, subjecting Sunny to a piercing stare. "What about you, young man?" Sunny shifted uncomfortably, suspecting that there was a hidden meaning to the question. He shrugged. "I feel like it's a good fit for my abilities." Wake of Ruin studied him for a few seconds, then nodded. "Good. You've performed admirably as advanced scouts. However, it's a waste of your talents." Both Sunny and Jet straightened, looking at the saint with slightly startled expressions. Noticing their reaction, the old man remained impassive. "Consider yourself reassigned effective immediately. The proper paperwork is already being delivered to the SRU headquarters." "What?" Sunny stared. "Just like that, they got a new job? Without even being asked?" Jet cleared her throat. There were many questions burning in Sunny's mind, but she asked the most important one. "Sorry, sir, but reassigned to where?" Saint Cor stared at her for a moment, then pointed to himself. "My personal retinue. That's officially. Unofficially, however, you'll be acting as special envoys assigned to the legacy forces. Each of you will be a contact person between the evacuation army and the great clans." Sunny suddenly hated how opulent and lavish the spacious hall was. He frowned. "With all due respect, sir, I get it why Ascended Jet might be considered a good candidate for such a position, but what do I have to do with any of it? Surely, you must know that my relationship with the great clans is a bit rocky. That is not even mentioning whether I want the job or not." He had spent 6 months hiding in the waking world to avoid the wrath of clan valor, after all. Had the old saint gone senile, or what? Wake of Ruin turned his heavy gaze back to Sunny and calmly raised an eyebrow. "On the contrary, I think that you are the best person for the job, Ascended Sunless. You are quite close to one of the leaders of the Valor delegation, no?" Sunny tilted his head a little. "That depends on who that leader is, I guess." Saint Cor smiled slightly. The smile made his gaunt, pale face look even more unnerving. The old man glanced at an antiquated wristwatch adorning his hand, and then said, his voice sounding cold and aloof, "Why, it's young Lady Nifis of Valor, the Changing Star, of course." He looked away from the watch and added matter-of-factly, "She'll be arriving alongside Valor's other emissaries soon. Actually, I think they'll be there in a few minutes." Sunny's eyes widened. Chapter 1098, Appalling Curse. "I certainly knew that Neff was coming to Antarctica, but why is Wake of Ruin calling her one of the Huh? What? In a few minutes?" Sunny stared at the veteran saint, dumbfounded. He had been anticipating meeting Neef again for a long time, but now that it was mere minutes away, his thoughts were in disarray. Did she check out my runes recently? Does she know that I'm a tyrant now too? Wait, no. Why do I care if she knows or not? I shouldn't. Jet seemed a little surprised too. Weren't they supposed to arrive in a couple of days? St. Cor shrugged. They were, but with Tyrus receiving some free time due to the three of us being beaten black and blue in the last battle, the schedule has been moved up, ascended sunless, and you arrived just in time. Sonny tried to digest the information. He knew that the legacy reinforcements would be coming in 2 waves. The second one consisted of the bulk of their forces, traveling by sea, while the first one was supposed to be the vanguard and consisted of just a few people. They were going to travel to Antarctica through the Dream Realm. The process was both simple and complicated. They needed a saint who had already established a tether in the southern quadrant, in this case, Saint Tyrus. The members of the vanguard had to either already be anchored in the same citadel as she, or be brought there by a different transcendent. Then, Sky Tide would be able to bring them with her to the waking world, thus transporting the necessary people to Antarctica. The vanguard had to be small because saints were limited in how many living creatures they could carry with them between the 2 worlds, just like masters were limited in how much inanimate weight they could bring. Usually, a saint could only transport 1 or 2 people at a time, and that consumed a fair amount of essence. Coming to a sudden realization, Sonny looked around. He was starting to understand why such a lavish place was chosen for their impromptu meeting. The opulence of the grand hall was not for the benefit of 2 ascended. Wake of Ruin was rolling out the red carpet for the powerhouses of the great clans. He looked at the old man, thinking. St. Cor smiled. I'm starting to suspect that you are not of a very high opinion about the great legacy clans, young man. Sonny gritted his teeth, trying to hide contempt and anger from seeping into his gaze. That is putting it lightly, sir. The old man studied him with a bit of curiosity. Why? Sonny gathered his thoughts, trying to come up with a convenient answer. Eventually, he said evenly, I guess it boils down to the fact that they are traitors. Wake of Ruin raised an eyebrow. Traitors? Interesting. How so? Sonny sighed. Awakened are supposed to be humanity's sword against the spell, no? The legacies are the greatest of the awakened, and yet they have seemingly given up on challenging the spell. Much worse, they refused to come out of the sheath when we needed them. This whole disaster could have been salvaged if they had done their duty. He had not mentioned the millions of people who had died in the Antarctic Center, and neither had he mentioned the tens of thousands of soldiers that perished with them. He doubted that such numbers could touch the heart of St. Cor. The old man was one of the leaders of the government, after all. People like him viewed the world in terms of billions of lives, spread across many decades. If Sonny told him that he was burning with anger toward the great clans because of the death of just 3 awakened, the old man would have probably thought him crazy. Wake of Ruin sighed. I see. Indeed, as long as you know anything about the world, it is easy to dislike the great clans. It is even easier to dislike them if you know a lot. But forgive me for sounding like a grumpy old man, ascended sunless. Young people like you really lack perspective. Sonny looked at him somberly. Do we? St. Cor nodded. It's not your fault, of course. One hand to be there and live through the worst of it to understand. You see, ascended sunless, and you too, Jet. People of your age were born in a stable world. It might be a cruel world and a harsh world, but it is a stable one nevertheless. Because it has been built that way by your predecessors. Many tend to look at the flaws of the world, but very few stop to question its foundations. And those foundations, why, they might have been better, but they could have also been so much worse. He leaned back in his chair, looking into the distance with a neutral expression. The fact of the matter is that the great clans emerged from the chaos of the past, but they weren't the only ones fighting for power and dominance back then. There were other clans, other forces, and people with entirely different ideas about what the world should become. The things they did. It is a blessing, really, that those old monsters were buried in the past, and that the great clans ended up victorious. So, yes, you lack perspective. Sonny frowned. Other forces? Different ideas? No offense, sir, but you have some nerve saying such things to 2 people who grew up in the outskirts. Others might now feel the same way, but we enjoyed the premium experience of living in this stable world you praise so much. I struggle to imagine what ideas could have been worse. St. Cor looked at him coldly, then suddenly laughed. His laughter sounded like the caws of a hungry raven. Ah, you are a direct person, ascended sunless. I like it. He looked at Sonny with his dark, harsh eyes, the hint of mirth that had appeared in them for a moment dissipating without a trace. The gaunt old man shook his head. But you should make an effort to imagine it. A dying world ravaged by war. people who had all but forgotten how to be proper humans, and then, an even bigger disaster, but one that presented a great opportunity. An opportunity for some of them to become unimaginably powerful, unmistakably superior, entirely unrestrained, and all but unstoppable, free to make whatever they wanted from this new era. Freedom, young man. Freedom can be the most appalling curse in the world if it falls into the wrong hands. It is a terrifying thing. Wake of Ruin grew silent for a few moments and then smiled sarcastically. Here I go rambling again. Jet, you should have stopped me. In any case, our guests should be arriving any second now. The emissaries of valor will come first, and the emissaries of song will follow in a few hours. Help me welcome them, you two. He paused, then looked at Sunny and added in a neutral tone. For better or worse, the great clans are all we have now. We'll need their help to see this operation through. So, keep that in mind, young man. Sunny lingered for a bit, then reluctantly nodded. I can play nice, or at least pretend to play nice. We'll see how it goes. Chapter 1099 Vanguard. Before Sunny could answer, the atmosphere in the lavish hall seemed to change slightly. It was as though a wave of invisible energy rolled through it, making the air feel colder and sharper. Wake of Ruin sighed and turned around, looking at the empty space in the middle of the spacious chamber. It had been empty before, but now, 4 people were standing on the lacquered floor, surrounded by the scent of the dream realm. For a moment, it felt as though they were simply a memory of a forgotten nightmare. But then, the feeling disappeared, and they were simply there. It was not often that Sunny saw saints enter the waking world, and he had to admit that it was an eerie thing to witness. Were awakened and mundane people as startled when he suddenly appeared out of thin air in front of them? That idle thought streaked across his mind, and disappeared without a trace when Sunny realized who exactly he was looking at. His eyes widened slightly. 4 people. And, by coincidence, he knew each of them. The first one was Skytide. The saint of the White Feather clan appeared as she always did, tall, slender, with a posture like that of an arrow. She wore a light armor of lustrous steel, and her hair fell like a cascade of pale gold. Tyrus looked austere and beautiful, but also slightly inhuman because of her strange amber eyes and vertical pupils. She stood apart from the other 3, who all wore intricate suits of lusterless black armor. The first of the 3 immediately attracted Sunny's gaze. His heart moved slightly. Nephis looked different in the colors of House Valor. The black armor created a striking contrast against her ivory skin, silver hair, and cool gray eyes. She looked like a beautiful dark spirit that took the form of a deadly night to sow the seeds of discord and ruin in the mortal world. The second person was Morgan of Valor. Every time Sunny saw her, he was unnerved by how much she resembled her older brother. However, although Morgan and Mordred looked very much like reflections of each other, her demeanor was entirely different. Morgan had black wavy hair and alabaster skin. Her suit of armor was adorned by a vermilion cape, which was the same vibrant color as her vivid scarlet eyes. Her entire being radiated the feeling of lethal sharpness, as if she was a living blade. However, it was the third person that made Sunny's eyes widen in guarded shock. He was a tall and severe man, with sharp facial features and even sharper eyes. His hair was black as Morgan's. In fact, there was a lot of familiar likeness between them, and touched by silver at the temples. His strong figure radiated an almost palpable feeling of authority and pressure, and his steely blue eyes were calm and piercing. The armor he wore was simpler than that of the other 2, as though the man did not need its protection. A deep frown appeared on Sunny's face. Saint Madoc, what the hell is he doing here? Indeed, the man was none other than Saint Madoc, the Whispering Blade, brother of Anvil and the nominal leader of the great clan Valor. As Sunny watched, Sir Madoc turned his head and smiled calmly, somehow making his smile look both friendly and demanding submission. Wake of Ruin. The gaunt old man was standing in front of Sunny and Jet, staring at the newcomers with a neutral expression. He lingered for a moment before saying in his hoarse voice, "Whispering Blade, I have to admit, your appearance is a bit of a surprise." Maddox's pleasant smile widened slightly. "Isn't it only right for me to be here? My clan announced its full support for the brave men and women of the evacuation army. That, of course, includes my personal assistance." Sunny tried to read the silent conversation that was happening between the 2 transcendents. Surely their words had other meanings. Saint Cor was probably trying to understand why the sovereign had gone as far as to send his own brother to Antarctica. Madoc, in turn, was letting him know that Anvil was putting a lot of importance into what was about to happen in the southern quadrant. Whispering Blade laughed slightly, then raised his hand. However, you shouldn't be addressing me. I'm just here to offer support and make sure that nothing untoward happens. The true leader of this expedition is my niece, Morgan. She will be in charge of everything. She gestured toward Morgan, and then threw an even gaze at Nephis. And of course my other niece will be supporting her in this endeavor. I trust you know Changing Star. The three of us are the vanguard of the Valor Force. Wake of Ruin remained silent for a few moments, then nodded slowly toward Morgan. In that case, welcome to Antarctica, Lady Morgan, Lady Nephis. He threw a heavy glance toward Whispering Blade, and then said evenly, "How curious that there are two saints in your group, as well as the granddaughter of Immortal Flame, and yet all three of you seem to be subordinated to a young woman with no known achievements to her name. Some could see it as a sign that Valor is not taking this matter seriously." Morgan looked at the fearsome Transcendent and then smiled. It seemed that his barely disguised provocation had no effect on her whatsoever. Her voice was calm and indifferent. "You are mistaken, Saint Cor. Clan Valor takes this matter extremely seriously, which is why I have been entrusted with considerable power and authority." Wake of Ruin sighed. "Forgive this old man for being frank, Lady Morgan, but what kind of authority can a mere ascended wield? I have half a dozen titans wandering the continent and 27 cities to protect. What can you actually do to alleviate my problems?" Morgan shrugged silently and then took a step back. Madoc, Tyrus, and Nephis remained motionless as a whirlwind of sparks suddenly filled the spacious hall. "What the?" As Sunny watched, an echo manifested from the hurricane of sparks, and then another, and then another. 3, 6, 12, 15. A few moments later, the large hall suddenly did not seem as large anymore. 15 harrowing nightmare creatures filled it, each giving off a sense of vast and dreadful power. Sunny stared, suddenly feeling cold. Transcendent. They are all transcended echoes. How many thousands of corrupted nightmare creature had to be slaughtered to produce these echoes? The weakest of them was a transcendent demon, while the most powerful was a transcendent tyrant. And that was only what Morgan had chosen to show. Who knew what she kept hidden? The Princess of War smiled politely as she looked at Wake of Ruin. "These are my credentials. Are you satisfied, Transcendent Core?" Chapter 1100 Accumulation. 15 transcendent echoes, most of them devils. Sunny simply stared, mentally recalculating the threat level of the Valor Force and of the great clans in general. "I knew, of course, that the hidden power of the sovereigns is vast, but it seems that I've been concentrating on their personal might too much, mostly because it is both mysterious and phenomenal. However, there is the mundane power of accumulation as well. I've been a fool to neglect it. To everyone else, a corrupted abomination was a dreadful nightmare, even to saints. Transcendents fought against the corrupted and were more than capable of slaying them. But every such fight was a risk, especially against the creatures of higher classes. The Supremes, however, were equal to the great nightmare creatures. Sunny had been under the impression that the sovereigns mostly stayed within the confines of their domains, but maybe he was not entirely right. Someone like Anvil or Ki Song could slaughter corrupted abominations with the same ease he could butcher awakened creatures. It only made sense that they had accumulated a legion of powerful echoes over the decades, including scores of transcendent ones. Sunny suddenly broke out in a cold sweat. Hell. Who says that transcendent echoes are the limit? Since the sovereigns could fight on equal footing with great nightmare creatures, then didn't it mean that they could possess supreme echoes as well? To this day, Sunny had only seen two great abominations. One was the unborn spawn of the vile thieving bird, and the other, most likely, was the dark sea of the forgotten shore. What would it look like if a creature like that was turned into an echo? Was Morgan in possession of a supreme echo? Did she have an echo of a titan slumbering in her soul sea? He lingered for a moment, then glanced at Nephis, who stood in front of the army of monsters with an impassive expression on her calm, beautiful face. "You want to destroy this?" He closed his eyes for a moment. "Damn that lunatic. She must have infected me with her madness, because I really want to make these bastards pay too." At this point, it was hard to say whose madness was more virulent. Sunny shook his head, then looked at Wake of Ruin, who was staring at Morgan with an unreadable expression. Eventually, the old man said in an even voice, "Put those things away. They'll ruin the floors." "What?" Morgan tilted her head a little and silently dismissed the echoes. St. Cor nodded. "Good. I see that your clan is as shrewd as ever. These echoes will be of great help, if used correctly, of course." Sunny was thinking feverishly. Saint Tyrus is a vassal of Valor, but the reinforcements they sent are all direct members of the clan. Maddock, Morgan, Nephis, and one more saint who is escorting the main force across the ocean. With these 15 transcendent abominations, they alone could be considered on par with the entire evacuation army, if not more powerful than us, and the forces of Song will be just as powerful. There was already one saint of the Song clan in East Antarctica, a vassal, just like Skytide. 2 more were coming, both direct members of the clan, as well as several hundred awakened and several powerful masters. Who would these people be? What hidden aces would they bring along? Is that guy coming? Surely he was. Mordred had joined Song to avenge himself on Valor in the first place. He wouldn't miss a chance to make his former clan bleed. The Prince of Nothing alone was more frightening than 15 transcendent echoes. Sunny almost groaned. These bastards are going to destroy the entire continent. Even though Antarctica was meant to be merely a prologue to the War of the Great Clans, that prologue was already promising to be the most chilling of disasters. It would be a cataclysm. Everyone in the hall must have understood the magnitude of the approaching collision. However, no one seemed rattled by it. Wake of Ruin and Jet seemed a bit somber, but calm, too jaded to be shaken by the promise of appalling bloodshed. St. Tyrus was reserved and stoic. Maddock and Morgan, they hid it well, but Sunny could see bloodlust and readiness in their eyes. As for Nephis, she appeared the calmest of them all. She might have fooled everyone else, but he knew what kind of hatred dwelled in her burning, murderous heart. The more the members of the great clans killed each other, the more exhilarated she would be. As he thought about the grim prospects of the nearest future, Morgan looked around with curiosity. Her voice had a hint of anticipation in it. I see that our colleagues from the great clan Song have not arrived yet? Wake of Ruin nodded. Indeed. They'll only be here in a few hours. Really, that makes things awkward for me. There is a lot we need to discuss regarding the current situation on the continent and your future role in keeping it in human hands. But what am I supposed to do? Repeat myself all over again when the Song Vanguard arrives? He shook his head with resignation. Sunny could just imagine that war meeting. 3 sides discussing important matters of strategy, with everyone present perfectly aware of the fact that most of the gathered powerhouses were actually planning to kill each other, and with the few bystanders only wondering about how to make them kill each other in the most convenient way, all the while pretending not to know anything, of course. What a joke. It was really funny. He barely held back laughter. At that moment, Saint Cor suddenly threw a glance toward Jet and Sunny. His grating voice resounded in the spacious hall. So, make yourself comfortable for the moment. We'll convene when the other party arrives. These are 2 of my best people, by the way. Ascended Jet and Ascended Sunless. You all know Soul Reaper, so I won't say anything. Young Master Sunless, however, has only earned his reputation recently. The soldiers are calling him the Devil of Antarctica, from what I hear. The veteran saint chuckled. A fitting nickname if I ever heard one. In any case, these 2 will be my envoys for your 2 great clans. Timeliness has to be rewarded, so pick one. I'll send the other to accompany the Song people. Both Sunny and Jet stared at him, not sure how to feel about being handled that way. It was as if they were livestock, a precious livestock, but still. What a rude bastard. Sunny turned to look at the emissaries of Valor, frowning slightly. Morgan glanced at him, then studied Jet for a while. Eventually, she smiled. Why? We'll take Master Sunless. He's my dear sister's former companion after all. I feel like we're good friends already.